In the late summer of 2009, a 34-year-old woman named Kane Kijima was known to her neighbors as a soft-spoken, talented home cook who attended prestigious culinary classes and wrote a blog about the joys of domestic life. She was the picture of traditional grace, looking for a simple, stable marriage through popular dating websites. She seemed like the kind of woman who would spend her weekends baking bread and caring for a family. But instead of building a happy home with the men she met, Kane would watch them fall into a permanent sleep in rooms filled with the toxic fumes of charcoal briquettes. The mystery is not just how she killed them, but why a woman who appeared to be the perfect, nurturing partner would meticulously orchestrate the cold-blooded execution of the very men who offered her the future she claimed to want, taking their money and leaving their bodies behind. Before we get started, please do me a quick favor. Go ahead and hit that like button. If you really want to help, try to click it exactly 3 times in a row. If you do it right, the little thumb might turn into a tiny charcoal briquette and start smoking. Also, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is for you. Most importantly, make sure your doors and windows are locked. If you have a security camera, give it a quick look right now. You want to know you are safe. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. We have people listening from every corner of the earth, and it is truly incredible to have you all here. So, let us know if you are in a quiet office, a busy car, or just at home. Now, let us get into our first story, the strange case of the Kankatsu killer. The scent of savory miso soup and freshly steamed rice is usually the smell of comfort in a Japanese home. It is a warm, earthy aroma that signals the end of a long day and the beginning of a peaceful evening. But on this particular night, in August of 2009, that comforting smell was being slowly overtaken by something far more sinister. It was a faint, metallic odor, like burnt earth or old soot, creeping into the hallway of a quiet apartment building. If you were standing in that hallway, you might have also heard a very faint, rhythmic sound. It was the sound of a small, focused flame licking against the side of a ceramic pot. There was no music playing. There were no voices, just the steady, patient crackle of charcoal briquettes as they began to glow a deep, hellish red. The air in the room was becoming heavy, thick with an invisible weight that made your lungs feel like they were pulling in hot lead instead of oxygen. Kane Kijima was 34 years old and lived in a world where appearances meant everything. To the people in her high-end culinary classes in Tokyo, she was a dedicated student who possessed a rare, almost old-fashioned talent for traditional Japanese cooking. She was not a conventionally beautiful woman, but she had a way of speaking that was incredibly soothing. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that suggested she came from a very wealthy and stable background. She spent a lot of her time writing on her blog, which she called A Kane Kitchen. She would post photos of elaborate French pastries, perfectly arranged bento boxes, and flowers she had picked for her dining table. She told her readers that her greatest dream was to become the perfect wife, to cook for a husband every day, and to live a life of simple, domestic bliss. People who read her blog felt like they knew her, like she was a friend who just wanted to find love. In the mid-2000s, a new trend was taking over Japan called kankatsu, which literally translates to marriage hunting. It was a serious, organized way for people to find life partners through specialized websites. Unlike casual dating apps, kankatsu was for people who wanted to get married as soon as possible. Kane became a regular on these sites. She didn't look for young, flashy men. She looked for older, lonely men who had stable jobs and significant savings. Every single morning, Kane followed a routine that was as precise as a chemist's formula. She would wake up early and spend at least 2 hours answering messages from her various suitors. She had several different profiles under different names, but they all shared the same theme. She was a woman of high class who had fallen on hard times and just wanted a man to take care of her. She would write long, handwritten-style emails that made these men feel special. After finishing her correspondence, she would head to the luxury grocery stores in the Ginza district. She wouldn't just buy any ingredients. She would spend 45 minutes picking out the perfect piece of Wagyu beef or the most symmetrical mushrooms. She would talk to the shopkeepers about the weather and the best way to marinate fish. She was a known face in these stores, always polite, always paying in cash from a thick envelope she kept in her designer purse. Then she would go home and spend the entire afternoon practicing her recipes. She would chop vegetables with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. Thump, thump, thump. She would stand over her stove for hours, adjusting the heat by a fraction of a degree. She believed that the key to a man's heart was through his stomach, but she also believed that the meal had to be a performance. Everything had to be perfect, from the temperature of the steak to the way the napkins were folded. She would often take the train to different cities like Saitama or Chiba to meet these men. She would bring small, wrapped gifts, usually cookies she had baked herself. She would sit across from them in quiet restaurants and listen to them talk about their lives, their loneliness, and their bank accounts. She was an expert listener. She would lean in, nod at exactly the right moments, and make them feel like they were the most interesting people in the entire world. There was one specific item that Kane began to buy that didn't quite fit her image as a gourmet chef. She started visiting hardware stores on the outskirts of town, places where no one would recognize her. She would walk past the luxury kitchenware and go straight to the camping section. There, she would buy boxes of charcoal briquettes and small, portable ceramic grills known as shichirin. To the clerk, she just looked like someone planning a summer barbecue. But Kane lived in a modern apartment building where indoor charcoal grilling was strictly forbidden due to the risk of fire and carbon monoxide. She didn't have a balcony or a backyard. Yet, she would carry these heavy boxes up to her room, one by one. She also began to frequent different pharmacies, buying over-the-counter sleeping medications. She told the pharmacist that she was suffering from severe insomnia due to the stress of her upcoming wedding. One of the men she was seeing was a 53-year-old man named Kenichi. He was a kind, hard-working man who lived alone in Chiba. He thought he had hit the jackpot when he met Kane. She told him she was a student at a top university and that her father was a famous businessman. Kenichi was so enamored that he had already sent her over 5 million yen to help with her tuition and family debts. He truly believed that by the end of the year, they would be married. On a warm evening in August, Kenichi invited Kane over to his house. She arrived with a large bag of groceries and a sweet smile. She spent the evening in his kitchen, preparing what she promised would be the best meal he had ever eaten. The house was filled with the smell of rich broth and soy sauce. Kenichi sat at the table, watching her move with grace, feeling like the luckiest man in Japan. He didn't notice when she slipped several white pills into his drink. As the meal progressed, Kenichi began to feel an overwhelming sense of lethargy. He thought it was just the wine or the heat of the summer night. His eyelids felt like they weighed 20 pounds each. He tried to keep the conversation going, to tell Kane how much he appreciated her, but his tongue felt thick and heavy in his mouth. He looked across the table at Kane, and she was just smiling at him, her eyes bright and encouraging. She told him to just close his eyes. Your head is lolling to the side. You can feel the rough fabric of the chair against your neck, but you can't move your muscles to straighten up. You hear the sound of someone moving around the room, the soft shuffle of slippers on the floor. You want to ask what is happening, but you can't even find the breath to speak. Then, you hear a strange sound. It is a metallic scrape, followed by the striking of a match. A new smell enters the room, something dry and smoky. You are sitting in that chair, trapped in your own body. You are aware that the air is changing. It is becoming harder to pull a full breath into your lungs. You feel a strange warmth spreading through the room, but it isn't the warmth of a blanket. It is a dry, suffocating heat. Do you fight the sleep that is pulling at you? Do you try to knock over the glass on the table to make a sound? Or do you just let go, trusting the woman who just cooked you dinner? Kenichi never woke up. The next morning, his body was found in his bed. The room was sealed from the inside with packing tape. On the floor next to him was a small charcoal grill, filled with ash. It looked like a clear-cut case of suicide. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, and no reason to suspect foul play. In Japan, The police are often hesitant to investigate suicides deeply if there is a charcoal grill present, as it is a common and tragic method. But Kenichi wasn't the first. A few months earlier, another man named Takao Terada had died in the exact same way. And before him, a man named Yoshiyuki Oide had been found dead in a rented car in a parking lot, also with a charcoal grill. All three men had one thing in common. They were all active on marriage hunting websites. And all three men had been in contact with a woman who went by the name Kanai, just days before their mysterious and sudden deaths. The police began to look closer at Kanai Kijima. They discovered that she wasn't a wealthy student at all. She was a high-end con artist who had stolen over 100 million yen from at least 20 different men. She used the money to pay for her luxury apartment, her culinary classes, and her expensive designer clothes. She was a black widow who had turned the traditional dream of marriage into a conveyor belt of death, all to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford. When they finally arrested her, they found a stash of charcoal briquettes and sleeping pills in her home. They also found the bank records, showing the massive transfers of money from her victims. During the trial, Kanai remained perfectly calm. She didn't look like a killer. She looked like the woman from the blog, polite and soft-spoken. She claimed the men had committed suicide because they were depressed, and that she had nothing to do with their final choices. The Japanese public was fascinated and horrified. They couldn't understand how a woman who didn't fit the femme fatale stereotype could manipulate so many men so easily. But Kanai understood something very simple. She knew that loneliness is a powerful weapon. She knew that if you give a lonely man a warm meal and a promise of a future, he will stop looking at the red flags. He will ignore the smell of the charcoal until the smoke has already filled the room. In 2012, Kanai Kijima was sentenced to death by hanging. She appealed the sentence multiple times, but her conviction was upheld. Even from prison, she continued to write her blog, maintaining her image as a lady of class and taste. She even got married while on death row to a man who had become a fan of her writing. She remains one of the most notorious serial killers in Japanese history, a reminder that the most dangerous predators don't always growl. Kanai Kijima is still waiting for her sentence to be carried out in a Japanese prison. She spends her days in a small cell, a far cry from the luxury kitchens she once haunted. She has never expressed a single ounce of remorse for the lives she extinguished. But while the silence of the Japanese prison system surrounds Kanai, 7,000 miles away in the Philippines, a very different kind of silence was about to be shattered by the sound of a government machine. In the late autumn of 2009, a convoy of 6 vehicles carrying 58 people set out on a bright, sunny morning in the province of Maguindanao in the Philippines. The group consisted of lawyers, female relatives of a local politician, and 32 journalists who were there to witness a simple act of filing election paperwork. They were traveling in broad daylight on a main highway, protected by the presence of the national media and the visibility of the sun. They believed that no one would dare to touch a group that included so many women and members of the press. But instead of reaching their destination, the entire convoy would be forced off the road by an army of nearly 200 armed men and led into the mountains. There, they would all be slaughtered and buried in a massive pit that had been prepared in advance by a government-owned backhoe. The mystery is why a political family felt so untouchable. They believed they could erase 58 lives in a single hour and literally bury the evidence in the dirt using official state equipment. This was a crime that was not hidden in the shadows or done in secret. It was a loud, brutal, and public execution carried out by the very people who were supposed to be the law. The world would soon learn that in this part of the country, the dirt held secrets that were far more terrifying than anyone could have ever imagined. The heat in the southern Philippines in November is not just a temperature. It is a physical weight that sits on your shoulders and fills your lungs with a thick, humid haze. On that Monday morning, the sun was already beating down on the dusty road that cut through the lush, green hills of Maguindanao. The air smelled of damp earth, tropical vegetation, and the faint, acrid scent of diesel exhaust from the aging vans that made up the long election convoy. If you were standing near the highway, you would have heard the low, rhythmic thrumming of the engines as the 6 vehicles moved slowly through the heat. But beneath that mechanical sound, there was a different noise echoing from the distant hills. It was a heavy, metallic clanking. The sound of a large machine, a backhoe, its metal treads grinding against the rocks, and its hydraulic arms hissing as it clawed a massive, rectangular hole into the side of a hill. Ismail Mangudadatu was a man who believed in the power of the democratic process. He was a local politician who wanted to challenge the long-standing rule of the Ampatuan clan, a powerful family that had controlled the province for years. Ismail was a family man, known for his calm demeanor and his desire to bring a new kind of leadership to his people. He was someone who understood the risks of politics in this region, but he still believed in the law. He knew that the Ampatuans would try to stop him from filing his certificate of candidacy. Because of the threats, Ismail decided to stay behind, thinking that his rivals would never attack a group made up mostly of women and journalists. He sent his wife, Jenilyn, and his sisters, believing their gender would be a shield in a traditional culture. He invited 32 journalists to ride along, thinking that the eyes of the world would keep his family safe. The journey began around 9 o'clock in the morning. The convoy was made up of several white Toyota Hiace vans and a couple of other vehicles. Inside the vans, the atmosphere was almost festive. The journalists were chatting, checking their cameras, and joking about the heat. They were professional storytellers, used to covering difficult topics, but today felt like a routine assignment. They had their notebooks ready and their water bottles tucked into the door pockets. The vans moved slowly because of the uneven pavement and the frequent military checkpoints along the route. Every few miles, the drivers would have to slow down to a crawl as they passed through areas guarded by men in camouflage uniforms. The journalists didn't think much of it. In Maguindanao, seeing armed men was as common as seeing coconut trees. It was just part of the landscape. They kept driving, the air conditioning in the vans struggling against the sun. The mundane stretch of this trip lasted for nearly an hour. The journalists spent a long time discussing the upcoming election, speculating on what the Ampatuans might do to intimidate the opposition. They talked about their families, their upcoming holiday plans, and the stories they were working on for the next day's newspaper. They passed small villages, where children waved at the passing cars and farmers worked in the fields with their water buffaloes. One journalist, a man who had worked in the region for 20 years, was meticulously cleaning his camera lens with a small microfiber cloth. He did it over and over, making sure there wasn't a single speck of dust that could ruin the shot of Jenilyn Mangudadatu filing the papers. He checked his spare batteries and his memory cards, lining them up in his bag in a specific order. He was a man of routine, a man who found comfort in the tiny details of his professional craft. They stopped briefly at a roadside stall to buy some extra bottles of water and some snacks. The transaction was quick and ordinary. The shopkeeper smiled, took the crumpled bills, and handed over the plastic bottles. No one noticed the way the local residents were quietly moving away from the road, or the way the usual chatter in the village seemed to have died down. The convoy pulled back onto the highway, the tires kicking up a thick cloud of yellow dust behind them. The road ahead was a long, straight stretch that disappeared into the shimmering heat haze. The drivers were focused on avoiding the largest potholes, their hands gripped loosely on the steering wheels. Everything about the morning suggested that this was just another day in the southern Philippines. There was no sign of the storm that was about to break. The journalists were just waiting for the next checkpoint, hoping it would be the last one before they reached the town. The first subtle shift happened at a place called City Masale. As the convoy rounded a bend, they saw a large group of armed men blocking the road. This wasn't a standard military checkpoint. These men were wearing a mix of civilian clothes and police uniforms, and they were carrying heavy assault rifles. More importantly, there were nearly 200 of them. They weren't just checking IDs, they were positioned as if they were waiting for a specific target. A police officer, a man who should have been there to protect the public, stepped forward and signaled for the lead vehicle to stop. He didn't smile, and he didn't ask for papers. He simply pointed his rifle at the driver's head. The journalists in the back of the van felt a sudden, cold jolt of adrenaline. The air in the vehicle, which had been filled with light conversation just seconds ago, suddenly became silent and incredibly heavy with the weight of realization. You are sitting in the middle row of a crowded van. You can hear the rapid, shallow breathing of the person sitting next to you. You look out the window and see dozens of men with their fingers on the triggers of their weapons, surrounding your vehicle. You realize that the journalist's IDs hanging around your neck are not shields, they are just pieces of plastic. Your heart is hammering against your ribs so hard that it feels like it might actually bruise your chest. The vans are forced off the main road and onto a rough, dirt track that leads up into the hills. The vehicles are bouncing violently over the rocks, and you are being thrown against the side of the van. You see the faces of the gunmen through the glass, and they are blank, devoid of any emotion. They have done this before. Do you try to hide your phone? Do you try to send a final message to your family? Or do you just freeze, hoping that this is all a massive mistake? The convoy reached a remote clearing on a hillside. There, waiting for them, was a large yellow backhoe with the words Province of Maguindanao painted on the side. This was a piece of heavy equipment owned by the local government, meant for building roads and helping the community. But today, it was there for a much darker purpose. The gunmen forced everyone out of the vans at gunpoint. There was no negotiation, there was no mercy. There was only the sound of gunfire. One by one, the victims were led to the edge of the pit that the backhoe had already started digging. The journalists, the lawyers, and the women were executed in a hail of bullets. The killers didn't care who they were. They were witnesses, and in the eyes of the Ampatuan clan, witnesses had to be erased. After the shooting stopped, the backhoe operator began his work. He pushed the bodies into the hole, and then he did something that shocked the entire world. He didn't just bury the people. He used the massive metal bucket of the backhoe to crush the vehicles, turning the Toyota vans into mangled heaps of steel. He pushed the flattened vans into the pit on top of the victims, attempting to hide the entire convoy under several tons of earth. The goal was simple: no bodies, no vehicles, no crime. They believed that if they buried the evidence deep enough in the Philippine soil, the world would never find out what happened. But the killers were interrupted. A military helicopter was spotted in the distance, and the gunmen fled before the burial was complete. When the soldiers arrived at the site, they saw the yellow backhoe still idling next to a half-filled hole. As they began to dig, they found a horror that defied description. They found the journalists, with their cameras still gripped in their hands. They found the women who had hoped their presence would be a peaceful barrier. The investigation into the Maguindanao massacre would go on for a decade. It would expose the terrifying power of local warlords and the corruption that allowed a single family to treat an entire province like their personal kingdom. In 2019, nearly 10 years after that bloody morning, several members of the Ampatuan family were finally convicted of 57 counts of murder. It remains the deadliest single attack on journalists in human history. The victims of the massacre are buried now in marked graves, but the land where they died still bears the scars of that day. The yellow backhoe became a symbol of how government power can be twisted into a tool of absolute evil. But while the soil in the Philippines was being turned over to reveal a mass grave, thousands of miles away in the city of Tijuana, another man was working with a very different kind of hole, and he wasn't using dirt to hide the bodies. In the early months of 2009, Santiago Meza Lopez was a man known to his small circle in Tijuana as a quiet, unassuming construction worker. He was the kind of guy who showed up on time, did his job, and went home to his family without ever raising his voice or causing a scene. He looked like any other middle-aged man you would see on a job site, with calloused hands and a face lined by years of working under the harsh Mexican sun. But instead of building walls or pouring concrete foundations for the city's growing neighborhoods, Santiago spent his nights in a hidden, walled-off compound on the outskirts of town. There, he stood over industrial steel drums, filled with a boiling reactive liquid that hissed and popped in the darkness. The mystery is how a man could cook over 300 human beings, as if he were preparing a common stew, and then go home to sleep as if nothing happened. The discovery of what Santiago was actually doing would send shockwaves through the world, revealing a level of dehumanizing violence that was almost impossible to comprehend. He wasn't a soldier, and he wasn't a high-ranking kingpin. He was simply a man with a very specific, very macabre job description. He was the man who made people disappear from the face of the earth, leaving behind nothing but a memory and a few fragments of bone that refused to melt. The air in the industrial outskirts of Tijuana is usually thick with the smell of diesel fumes and dust, but inside the compound known as Ojo de Agua, the air was different. It was heavy with a sharp, chemical sting that burned the back of your throat and made your eyes water. It was the smell of caustic soda, a powerful alkaline substance that reacts violently when mixed with water. It is a smell that stays in your clothes and burrows deep into your skin. If you were standing near those industrial drums in the dead of night, you would hear a constant, rhythmic sound. It was the low, wet gurgle of a thick liquid reaching its boiling point. Ung-uk. Ung-uk. It sounded almost like a large pot of soup simmering on a kitchen stove, but there was no aroma of spices or meat. There was only the relentless, hissing steam rising into the cold night air, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odor that you couldn't quite name. Santiago Meza Lopez was 45 years old and had lived a life defined by invisibility. He had spent years working in the construction industry, moving heavy bags of cement and laying bricks for houses he would never be able to afford. He was a family man, and by all accounts, he was a good father who wanted to provide a better life for his children. He didn't have a criminal record, and he didn't have the tattoos or the swagger of a typical cartel hitman. In the mid-1990s, Santiago was offered a job that would change the trajectory of his life forever. A representative from the Arellano Felix cartel approached him with a simple proposition. They needed someone who was reliable, someone who could follow instructions, and someone who knew how to handle industrial chemicals. They offered him $600 a week, which was a fortune compared to the meager wages he earned on the construction sites. Santiago accepted the job without asking too many questions. At first, he was told he would just be disposing of waste for the organization. He was a man who understood the value of hard work and loyalty, and in the world of the Tijuana cartels, loyalty was the only currency that truly mattered. He became an expert in his craft, learning the precise ratio of water to lye needed to break down organic matter in the shortest amount of time possible. Every evening, Santiago followed a routine that was as methodical as any factory worker's shift. He would arrive at the compound just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. He would check the propane tanks, ensuring there was enough fuel to keep the fires burning throughout the night. He would line up the 200-liter steel drums in a neat, orderly row, making sure each one was clean and ready for the next batch of what he called his stew. The process began with filling the drums halfway with water. Santiago would then carefully measure out the caustic soda, pouring the white flakes into the water and stirring it with a long wooden pole. He had to be careful. The reaction generated intense heat and could cause severe chemical burns if it splashed onto his skin. He wore heavy rubber gloves and a basic face mask, moving with a calm, practiced efficiency that only comes from years of repetition. Once the mixture reached a rolling boil, the raw materials would be delivered to the compound in the back of unmarked trucks. Santiago wouldn't ask who they were or what they had done. He would simply do his job. He would lift the remains and place them into the boiling liquid, one by one. He would then spend the next 8 hours stirring the drums, making sure that everything was submerged and that the chemical reaction was working as intended. The mundane stretch of his work was defined by the long, lonely hours of the night. While the rest of Tijuana slept, Santiago stood under the dim glow of a single light bulb, his wooden pole moving in a slow, circular motion. He would listen to a small transistor radio to pass the time, the sound of traditional Mexican music mixing with the hissing of the steam. He would think about his family, his bills, and the simple life he led during the daylight hours. He treated the work like a science experiment. He knew exactly when to add more lye and when to turn down the heat. He didn't see the people in the drums as human beings. He saw them as a task that needed to be completed. He was a man of discipline. He never stole from the cartel, he never showed up late, and he never talked about his work to anyone. He was the perfect employee for an organization that specialized in making problems go away forever. As the years went by, a subtle shift began to occur in the results of his work. Despite the power of the caustic soda, some things simply refused to dissolve. At the bottom of the drums, after the liquid had done its work, Santiago began to find small, hard objects. They were human teeth and tiny fragments of bone that had been hardened by age or disease. These were the only physical traces left of the lives that had been poured into his industrial stew. Instead of being disturbed by these remnants, Santiago simply incorporated them into his cleanup routine. He would drain the spent liquid into a series of pits he had dug in the ground, and then he would collect the remaining bone fragments and teeth. He would take them to a separate area of the compound, a place the locals later called the chicken field, and he would bury them in shallow holes, covering them with fresh dirt and leveling the surface. You are standing over a 200-liter drum. The heat from the propane burner is radiating against your legs, and the steam is so thick you can barely see the person standing 5 feet away. In your hand is a long wooden pole, and as you stir, you feel a resistance at the bottom. You know what it is. You know that, just a few hours ago, this was a person with a name, a family, and a story. Your lungs are burning from the fumes, and your hands are cramped. The person next to you tells you to stir faster, to make sure nothing is left for the police to find. You look at the bubbling liquid, and you feel nothing. No fear, no disgust, just a deep, crushing exhaustion. Do you keep stirring, thinking about the $600 that will be in your envelope at the end of the week? Or do you drop the pole and run into the darkness, knowing that if you do, you might be the next person to end up in one of these drums? Santiago Meza Lopez didn't run. He kept stirring for 9 years. He was finally arrested in January of 2009 during a massive military raid on the cartel's safe houses. When the authorities brought him back to the compound, he didn't try to deny what he had done. He walked them through the site with a calm, almost helpful demeanor. He showed them the drums, the lie, and the pits where he had disposed of the liquid waste for so long. He confessed to cooking over 300 people during his career. He told the investigators that he didn't know who the victims were, and he didn't want to know. He was just the disposal man, but the most horrifying discovery was the chicken field. As forensic teams began to excavate the site, they didn't find bodies. They found a literal sea of teeth and bone fragments. It was a graveyard of dust, a place where hundreds of lives had been erased. The case of El Pozolero became a gruesome symbol of the Mexican drug war's dehumanizing violence. It showed how ordinary people could be drawn into the most horrific crimes through a combination of poverty and a complete desensitization to death. Santiago Meza Lopez was eventually sentenced to prison, but for the families of the thousands of missing people in Mexico, his confession offered a cold and terrifying kind of closure that no one wanted. Santiago's compound was a place of absolute silence and hidden horrors, where the only sign of what had happened was the disturbed earth in the backyard. The pits he dug were meant to swallow the evidence of 1,000 crimes, leaving the surface looking normal to any passerby. But while Santiago was burying his chemical waste in Tijuana, thousands of miles away in Cleveland, Ohio, another man was digging holes in his own backyard for a very different reason. He wasn't using acid to dissolve his victims, and he wasn't trying to hide the smell with chemicals. In fact, the odor coming from his house was so powerful that it would eventually lead the police to a discovery that was just as haunting as the bone fragments in Mexico. It was a smell that the neighbors couldn't ignore, a scent of decay that was rising from the very ground beneath their feet, waiting for someone to finally look down and see the truth. In the late autumn of 2009, Anthony Sowell lived in a 3-story house on Imperial Avenue in a hard-pressed neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio. To the people who lived on his block, Anthony was just a familiar face, a former Marine who often sat on his front porch and waved to passers-by. He was the kind of man who seemed to blend into the background of the city, just another neighbor trying to get by in a place where everyone had their own struggles. But instead of the normal smells of a family home, Anthony's house was the source of a horrific, rotting stench that was so powerful it could be smelled from blocks away. For 2 years, the people in the neighborhood walked past his house, covered their noses, and complained to the city, but they all blamed a nearby sausage factory for the odor. The mystery is how a man could live among the decomposing remains of 11 women while the world simply looked the other way. The discovery of what was hidden inside that house would reveal a level of depravity that shocked the entire nation. It wasn't just about the crimes of one man. It was about a collective failure to see the people who had gone missing right in front of their eyes. Anthony didn't hide in the shadows. He lived in plain sight, sitting on his porch, drinking beer, and watching the world go by, all while the evidence of his horrific deeds was literally rotting beneath his feet. The smell on Imperial Avenue was not something you could just ignore. It was a thick, sweet, and cloying scent that seemed to stick to your clothes and coat the inside of your throat. It was the kind of odor that made your stomach turn and your eyes water the moment you stepped off the bus. On a hot summer day, the air felt heavy and oily, as if the rot was a physical presence that you had to push through just to walk down the sidewalk toward the corner store. If you stood near the fence of the house at 12,205 Imperial Avenue, you would hear the constant, frantic buzzing of thousands of black blowflies. They swarmed around the window frames and clustered in the corners of the porch, their iridescent bodies shimmering in the sun. It was a relentless, low-pitched hum that never seemed to stop, a sound that signaled something was deeply wrong, even if no one was willing to say the words out loud. Anthony Sowell was 50 years old and carried himself with the disciplined posture of a man who had once served in the United States Marine Corps. He was often seen wearing a simple t-shirt and work pants, looking like any other retired veteran in the neighborhood. He was known to be a bit of a loner, but he wasn't unfriendly. He would often share a beer with people on the street and talk about local news, making him a fixture of the community's daily life. He lived in a neighborhood where people were used to seeing hard times, a place where many women struggled with addiction or homelessness. Anthony seemed to offer these women a place of refuge, a spot where they could sit down, have a drink, and escape the harsh reality of the streets for a few hours. He was seen as a relatively safe person, someone who had a roof over his head and a military background that suggested a certain level of stability and order. The mundane stretch of life on Imperial Avenue was defined by a slow, agonizing wait for the city to do something about the stench. Every single morning, the neighbors would wake up, open their windows, and be immediately hit by that nauseating wave of decay. They would call the health department, the police, and the local council members over and over again. They filed formal complaints, describing the smell as something that was making their children sick. In response to these complaints, city inspectors were sent out multiple times over a period of 2 years. They didn't go to Anthony's house, though. Instead, they focused all their attention on the Ray's sausage factory, which was located right next door. The inspectors would walk through the factory floors, checking the vents, the drainage systems, and the waste disposal units. They spent hours meticulously reviewing the factory's cleaning logs and maintenance records. The factory owners, desperate to prove they weren't the source of the problem, spent tens of thousands of dollars on new plumbing and advanced air filtration systems. They had their pipes professionally cleaned and their grease traps emptied every week, far more often than was required by law. They were doing everything right, following every procedure to the letter, but the smell only seemed to grow stronger, drifting over the fence from the house right next to them. Despite all the maintenance and the thousands of dollars spent on cleaning, the air remained toxic. The mundane stretch continued as the neighbors simply gave up, eventually coming to believe that this was just what life was like living near a factory. They started wearing masks when they hung their laundry out to dry and kept their children inside on the hottest days. They accepted the unacceptable, unaware that the answer was sitting right there on the porch next door. Anthony, meanwhile, continued his own quiet routine. He would walk to the local market, buy a few cans of cheap beer, and return to his house. He would spend his afternoons sitting in a plastic chair on his front porch, nodding to the people he knew. He was a master of acting normal. He would complain about the smell, along with everyone else, shaking his head and pointing toward the factory, playing the part of the frustrated neighbor with terrifying precision. The first subtle shift occurred when a woman managed to escape from Anthony's house and ran to the police, claiming she had been brutally assaulted. She told the officers that Anthony had lured her inside and then turned into a monster. This wasn't the first time a woman had made such a claim, but for a long time, the authorities had dismissed these reports, viewing the victims as unreliable witnesses because of their troubled backgrounds and difficult lives. But on October 29, 2009, the police finally decided to serve a warrant at Anthony's house. When the two officers approached the front door, they noticed that the flies weren't just on the porch, they were crawling out from the cracks in the door frame. The air was so foul that one of the officers had to pull his shirt over his nose just to keep from gagging. This didn't smell like a factory. This smelled like something much more human. You are standing in the dimly lit hallway of Anthony Soul's house. The air is so thick with the scent of rot that you can feel it on your skin, like a greasy film. Your flashlight cuts through the darkness, illuminating piles of trash and old furniture. As you take a step toward the staircase, you feel the floorboards beneath your heavy boots sink down. It isn't the solid creak of old wood. It is a soft, spongy sensation, as if you are walking on something wet. Your heart starts to race as you realize that the moisture seeping through the floor isn't water. You look down and see dark stains blooming across the carpet. Every instinct in your body is screaming at you to turn around and run back into the fresh air. But you are a police officer, and you have a job to do. Do you keep going up those stairs, knowing that the smell is coming from the rooms above? Or do you wait for backup, frozen by the sheer weight of the horror? The officers pushed forward, moving into the living room and then up to the second floor. In the crawl space of the house, they made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They found 2 decomposing bodies wrapped in plastic. As they continued to search the property, the horror only grew. They found bodies buried in shallow graves in the backyard and remains hidden in the basement. In total, the remains of 11 women were recovered. The bizarre reveal was that Anthony Soul hadn't just killed these women. He had lived with them. He had continued his daily life, eating, sleeping, and drinking in a house that was effectively a private morgue. He had used the presence of the sausage factory as a perfect cover, knowing that people would be more likely to blame a business for a bad smell than to imagine a serial killer was living in their midst. He had exploited the city's biases to hide his crimes. The community was devastated. The realization that 11 of their neighbors had been murdered and left to rot while everyone just covered their noses was a burden that many could not bear. The case prompted a massive investigation into the Cleveland Police Department's handling of missing person reports, especially those involving vulnerable women. It revealed a systemic failure to protect the very people who needed the most help from the city's predators. Anthony Soul was found guilty of 82 counts, including 11 counts of aggravated murder. In 2011, he was sentenced to death. He spent the rest of his life on death row, eventually dying of a terminal illness in prison in February of 2021. His house on Imperial Avenue was demolished, leaving behind a vacant lot that serves as a grim memorial to the women who lost their lives in the House of Horrors. The case of the Cleveland Strangler was a wake-up call for law enforcement across the country. It showed that when the voices of the vulnerable are ignored, the most dangerous people can thrive in the heart of our communities. Justice was eventually served for the women of Imperial Avenue, but it came far too late. It was a victory for the law, but a tragedy for humanity, proving that the most important part of any investigation is the willingness to listen. This failure of the authorities to look past their own prejudices is a recurring theme in the history of justice. While the people of Cleveland were fighting to have their voices heard against a local monster, halfway across the world in Russia, another woman was fighting a much larger system. She wasn't just facing a single killer. She was facing an entire government that wanted her to be silent about the horrific crimes she was documenting in the shadows. Natalia Estemirova knew that the stakes of her work were much higher than a local police report. She understood that in her world, the search for justice didn't just lead to a courtroom. It often led to a lonely ditch on the side of a road. She was a woman who refused to cover her nose or look away, even when the stench of corruption became more dangerous than any single man, knowing that her commitment to the truth might eventually cost her everything. Natalia Estemirova was a 50-year-old human rights activist in Chechnya who knew she was being watched every single second of every day. She lived in a city where people simply vanished into thin air if they spoke too loud or asked the wrong questions. She was a mother and a teacher who chose to walk the dangerous streets of Grozny, documenting the crimes that others were too afraid to even whisper. She knew her name was already on a kill list. But instead of being arrested or silenced through official channels, Natalia would be snatched in broad daylight in front of witnesses and dumped in a ditch in a neighboring republic. The mystery is why a woman who knew exactly how dangerous her work was refused to stop, even when she knew her time was running out. She was exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she felt was right, but her commitment to the truth would eventually cost her everything. The morning air in Grozny in July is usually thick with heat, and the smell of dry dust rising from the city streets. On that Wednesday, the 15th of July, 2009, the city was just beginning to wake up. You could hear the distant, rhythmic sound of a broom sweeping the pavement and the low hum of early morning traffic. But then, a sharp, violent sound tore through the quiet. It was the frantic squeal of tires on hot asphalt. A white Lada car screeched to a halt right in front of an apartment building. The sound of the car doors slamming was like two gunshots echoing in the narrow street. Then came a woman's voice, a short, piercing scream that was abruptly cut off by a heavy, thudding sound. It was the sound of a struggle, of someone being forced into a confined space against their will. Within seconds, the car sped away, leaving behind only a cloud of exhaust. Natalia Estemirova was not just another name in a report. She was a woman who had spent years as a history teacher before the wars turned her home into a graveyard. She was 50 years old, with a kind face and eyes that had seen far too much tragedy. She lived in a modest apartment with her teenage daughter, Lana, whom she loved more than anything in the world. To her neighbors, she was a quiet, respectful woman who always had a gentle word. But to the powerful men who ran Chechnya, Natalia was a constant thorn in their side. She worked for a human rights organization called Memorial, and her weapon was a simple notebook and a pen. She was a woman of routine and discipline, someone who believed that if you recorded a crime, it could never truly be erased. She was an anchor of normalcy in a place that had forgotten what normal looked like, standing up for the families of the missing. Every morning, Natalia followed a routine that was both a necessity and a form of quiet rebellion. She would wake up at 6 o'clock, make breakfast for her daughter, and ensure that everything in the house was in order. She would then dress in a professional manner, usually a simple skirt and a blouse, and pack her notebook into her bag. She didn't have a car, so she walked almost everywhere, her heels clicking steadily on the concrete of the city. The walk from her apartment to the memorial office took exactly 22 minutes if she didn't stop to talk to anyone. She knew every crack in the sidewalk and every corner where a security camera might be watching her. She would pass the rebuilt government buildings and the new mosques, symbols of a peace that she knew was built on top of secrets. She walked with her head held high, her eyes scanning the street with the practiced caution of a survivor. Once she reached her office, the mundane stretch of her day began. She would spend hours sitting at a small, cluttered desk, sorting through handwritten letters from mothers and wives whose sons and husbands had been taken in the night. She would cross-reference names with government lists, looking for patterns in the disappearances. It was slow, tedious work that required an incredible amount of patience and a very thick skin against the stories of pain. She would drink tea from a chipped ceramic mug, the steam rising as she listened to the frantic stories of strangers. She would take notes in a very specific, neat handwriting, never missing a detail about the color of the uniforms or the make of the cars used in the kidnappings. She was meticulous. She believed that every detail mattered. She would spend the entire afternoon typing these reports, the clacking of the keys filling the small, cramped room. Before she left the office each day, she would carefully back up her files and hide her notebooks. It was a routine born out of fear, but she did it with the same calm efficiency as if she were filing a grocery list. She would then walk home, stopping at the same small market to buy bread and milk. She would exchange pleasantries with the shopkeeper, talking about the rising prices of food, while her eyes caught the reflection of any car that stayed too long. She was a master of the mundane because it was her only shield. She believed that as long as she stayed visible, as long as she kept to her routine, she was safe. She thought that they wouldn't dare snatch a well-known activist in broad daylight on a busy street. But she was also a realist. She told her friends that if she ever disappeared, they should look for her immediately. She knew that in her world, time was the only thing that stood between life and death. The first subtle shift happened a few days before the kidnapping. Natalia noticed that the white Lada wasn't just passing her on the street. It was parked near her apartment building every single time she left. The windows were tinted dark, so she couldn't see who was inside, but she could feel the weight of their gaze. It was a subtle pressure, a change in the atmosphere that suggested the rules of the game were about to be changed without her consent. On that final morning, she noticed that the street was unusually quiet. The usual crowd of people waiting for the bus seemed to have vanished, and the police officer who was usually stationed at the corner was nowhere to be seen. It was as if a space had been cleared for something to happen. She gripped the strap of her bag a little tighter and kept walking, her heart beating a little faster against her ribs, but she refused to turn back or show any fear. You are walking down a familiar street in your home city. You can feel the sun warming your shoulders, and you are thinking about the report you need to finish by noon. Then, you hear the sudden roar of an engine behind you. You don't even have time to turn around before a car door swings open, and a pair of strong hands grab you by the arms. Your feet are dragged across the pavement, and you can smell the acrid scent of cheap tobacco and old car oil. You are being shoved into the back seat of a cramped car. Your bag is ripped from your shoulder, and your notebook falls to the floor. You look up and see the faces of the men, and you recognize the cold, indifferent eyes of people who have done this 100 times before. You try to scream, to call out for help to the people you see in the distance, but a hand is slammed over your mouth. Do you fight? Or do you realize that this is the moment you feared? Natalia fought. She managed to scream out her name and tell the witnesses that she was being kidnapped, hoping that her identity would be her final defense. But the men didn't care. They drove her out of the city, passing through checkpoints that seemed to open magically as they approached. They crossed the border into the neighboring Republic of Ingushetia. Hours later, her body was found in a wooded area near a main road, far from the city she loved. The bizarre reveal was not in how she died, but in the message it sent. She had been shot in the head and the chest at close range. Her notebook, which contained the names of people who had been tortured, was missing. The investigation into her murder was a charade from the very beginning. Evidence was lost, witnesses were intimidated, and the authorities eventually blamed a local insurgent who had conveniently been killed in a shootout with the police. The world reacted with horror, but in Chechnya, the silence only grew deeper. Natalia's death was the final signal that no one was safe, not even the most prominent activists. The Office of Memorial in Grozny was forced to close shortly after. Her daughter, Lana, was left to navigate a world without her mother's protection. The truth that Natalia had fought so hard to document was being buried under a new layer of fear and state-sponsored propaganda. Natalia Estemirova's legacy lives on in the few notes that were smuggled out of the country before her death. She remains a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice for human rights in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. Her death proved that sometimes, the most dangerous weapon you can carry is a simple notebook and the courage to use it. She knew the risks, she accepted the danger, and she chose to stand for justice until the very end of her life. The assassination of Natalia Estemirova was a calculated act of political violence, a targeted strike meant to silence a specific voice in a specific place. It was a tragedy born out of a long, dark history of conflict and corruption in the Russian Caucasus. But while the people of Chechnya were mourning their lost champion in July of 2009, just 4 months earlier and thousands of miles away, a very different kind of violence was occurring. In the quiet town of Winnenden, Germany, there were no political motives and no secret police lists. There was only a 17-year-old boy and a gun that should have been locked away. While Natalia's death was the result of a cold, professional plan, the horror that was about to unfold in a German school was a sudden, chaotic explosion of grief and rage that would leave an entire nation questioning how a normal morning could turn into a massacre. In March of 2009, Tim Kretschmer was a 17-year-old boy living in a stable, affluent German town with a father who was a responsible businessman and a member of a local shooting club. The family home was filled with security measures, and Tim had every opportunity for a bright future. He was a quiet kid, the kind of teenager who didn't cause trouble and seemed to just blend into the background of his comfortable, middle-class life. But instead of going to his classes, like any other student on a Wednesday morning, Tim would take his father's Beretta from an unlocked bedroom nightstand and unleash a wave of violence that would change Germany forever. The mystery is why a boy with no history of violence and access to everything he needed chose to destroy his world and everyone in it in a single morning. It was a day that began with the most ordinary routine, but ended in a nightmare. The hallways of the Albertville Realschule School in Winnenden are usually filled with the sound of chatter and the rhythmic scuffing of sneakers on linoleum. But on that morning, the air was cold and oddly still. Then, a sharp, metallic sound echoed through the corridors. It was the sound of a heavy door swinging open, followed by the distinctive, rhythmic clicking of hard-soled boots. There was no music, no laughter, just that steady, deliberate pace. If you were standing near the math wing, you would have smelled something sharp and chemical. It was the scent of burnt gunpowder and ozone, a smell that had no place in a building meant for learning. It was thick and acrid, clinging to the lockers and the posters on the walls. Beneath that smell was the faint, lingering aroma of cafeteria coffee and floor wax. It was a sensory collision between the extreme safety of school and the extreme danger of a weapon. Tim Kretschmer was 17 years old and lived in a house where discipline and order were the standard. His father was a successful businessman who owned several legal firearms, which he kept in high-quality gun cabinets. Tim was a boy who loved table tennis and played it with a focused, almost obsessive intensity. He wasn't the most popular kid in school, but he wasn't an outcast either. He was an anchor of normalcy in a town that prided itself on stability. He had just graduated from the school a year prior and was currently in a commercial apprenticeship. To his neighbors, he was the polite boy who helped carry groceries and never spoke out of turn. He lived in a world where everything had its place and everyone followed the rules. He was a reflection of the town of Winnenden itself, clean, quiet, and predictable. No one could have looked at him and seen the storm that was brewing behind his calm, teenage eyes. The morning of March 11th, 2009, began exactly like every other day in the Kretschmer household. Tim's father woke up at 6:30, made a pot of strong black coffee, and read the morning news. He was a man of habit. He checked his briefcase, straightened his tie in the hallway mirror, and prepared for another busy day at the office. He was the kind of man who valued precision in everything he did, from his business deals to his hobby at the range. Tim got out of bed around 7 o'clock. He dressed slowly, picking out a black tactical-style outfit that didn't seem out of place for a teenager who liked military history. He brushed his teeth, packed his bag, and went down to the kitchen. He didn't say much to his parents, but that was normal for a 17-year-old boy. He ate his breakfast in silence, the only sound being the clinking of his spoon against the bowl and the ticking of the clock on the wall. After his parents left for work, the house became perfectly still. Tim walked up the stairs to his parents' bedroom. He knew exactly where his father kept his weapons. Most of them were locked away in a heavy steel cabinet, but there was one that was not. A 9mm Beretta pistol was sitting in the nightstand, right next to the bed. Tim picked it up, feeling the cold weight of the metal in his hand. He also took several hundred rounds of ammunition. He spent the next 15 minutes meticulously loading the magazines. He didn't rush. He sat on the edge of the bed and pushed each brass cartridge into the spring-loaded clips over and over again. It was a repetitive, meditative task. He counted them out loud. 1, 2, 3. He filled his pockets with the extra magazines, the weight of the lead pulling on his clothes. He then walked out of the house, locked the front door behind him, and began the walk. The walk to his old school took about 20 minutes. He followed the same path he had taken for years, walking past the bakery where he used to buy snacks and the park where he played table tennis. The sun was out, but it was still chilly. He saw a neighbor walking a dog and nodded politely as they passed. He was just a kid with a backpack, walking to school. Nothing about his gait or his expression suggested that he was carrying enough firepower to end a dozen lives. He reached the Albertville Realschule just as the first period was ending. The campus was busy with students moving between classrooms. Tim blended in perfectly. He stood near the entrance for a few minutes, watching the flow of people. He was observing the routine, waiting for the exact moment when the hallways would be at their busiest. He gripped the straps of his backpack, feeling the hard edges of the ammunition boxes against his spine. He was ready. The first subtle shift occurred when Tim entered the building. Usually, visitors are supposed to check in at the front office, but Tim walked straight past the glass window. He didn't look at the secretary, and he didn't slow down. He moved with a sense of purpose that was different from the casual wandering of the students. He kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the floor ahead of him. He wasn't a student anymore, but he moved like he still belonged there. A teacher who recognized him from the previous year noticed him in the hallway. She thought it was strange to see him back so early in the morning, but she assumed he was just there to visit some old friends or pick up some paperwork. She opened her mouth to say hello, but something about the way he was walking stopped her. He was moving too fast, and his hands were buried deep in his pockets. She watched him turn the corner into the math wing and felt a chill. You are sitting in your third period math class. The teacher is writing equations on the chalkboard, and the only sound is the rhythmic scratching of 30 pencils on paper. You are thinking about what you want for lunch. Then, you hear a series of loud, sharp pops from the hallway. It sounds like someone is popping heavy-duty bubble wrap or maybe dropping heavy books. You look at your friend, and they laugh, thinking it is just a senior prank or a science project. Then the door to your classroom kicks open. A boy in black stands there, and for a split second, you think he is wearing a costume. Then you see the weapon in his hand. Your heart stops. The room goes from bored silence to absolute terror in less than a heartbeat. You see the flash of light and hear a sound so loud it makes your ears ring. You scramble under your desk, your fingers digging into the cold linoleum floor. Do you try to run, or do you just hide and pray? Tim moved through the school with terrifying efficiency. He didn't scream, and he didn't make a speech. He simply walked from room to room, firing with the cold precision he had learned from his father. In the span of just a few minutes, he killed 9 students and 3 teachers. Most of his victims were female, leading many to speculate that he was lashing out at the girls who had rejected him. He moved like a ghost through the halls he once knew so well. When the police arrived, Tim didn't stay to fight them. He fled the school and began a chaotic escape through the town. He hijacked a car, telling the driver he wanted to go to another city. During the drive, the driver asked him why he had done it. Tim reportedly replied, "Because it's fun." It was a chilling glimpse into the mind of a boy who had completely detached from reality. He eventually ended up at a car dealership in a nearby town, surrounded by police. The bizarre reveal came during the final shootout. Tim wasn't trying to escape anymore. He was looking for a way out of the world. After killing 3 more people at the dealership, he was wounded in the leg by a police bullet. Rather than surrender, he turned the gun on himself. When investigators searched his room later, they didn't find a manifesto or a clear motive. They found a boy who was obsessed with violence, but had hidden it perfectly from everyone. The aftermath of the Winnenden shooting led to a massive national debate in Germany about gun control. Tim's father was eventually held legally responsible for the massacre because he had failed to secure his Beretta as required by law. He was sentenced to 18 months of probation and lost his business and his reputation. The school was closed for months, and the town of Winnenden would never truly recover the sense of absolute safety it once took for granted. Tim Kretschmer's story is a haunting reminder that the most ordinary routines can mask the most extraordinary dangers. He was a boy who had everything, yet he chose to take everything from others. His actions proved that a single unlocked drawer can lead to a lifetime of grief for an entire nation. He left behind a legacy of questions that can never be fully answered, a boy who became a monster in the time it takes to walk from a bedroom to a classroom. The massacre at Winnenden was a tragedy of access and an outburst of inexplicable rage from a boy who seemed to have no reason to hate the world. It was a violent end to a normal life, a story of a shooter who found his victims in the light of day. But while Germany was tightening its gun laws in the wake of Tim's actions, halfway around the globe in China, a very different kind of tragedy was unfolding. This one didn't involve a gun or a school hallway. Instead, it involved a simple game that children play every day. In a detention center in Yunnan province, a young man was about to lose his life in a way that defied all logic. The authorities would claim he died while playing a game, a statement so absurd it would ignite a firestorm of public outrage. It was a paradox where a playful childhood memory was used to mask a brutal reality, proving that sometimes the truth is the most dangerous thing you can hide. In February of 2009, a 24-year-old man named Li Qiaoming was sitting in a detention center in China for a minor offense. He was a healthy, hard-working logger with a fiancée, and a bright future waiting for him back in his small village. He was exactly where he needed to be to pay his debt to society and move on. But instead of walking out of the front gates, Lee would end up in a hospital with a fatal brain injury that would end his life. The mystery is not just how he died, but why the authorities claimed he was killed while playing a game of hide-and-seek with other inmates. They suggested that a grown man had somehow managed to sustain a lethal blow to the head while engaging in a children's activity behind bars. The mystery is why they thought anyone would believe such a story, and what dark reality they were trying to bury beneath a phrase that would soon become a national scandal across the world. Tonight, I am going to tell you stories about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious in ways they never could have prepared for. But before we get into our next case, if you could please do me a huge favor. If you enjoy these stories, please invite the like button to a friendly game of hide and seek in a dark forest. But the second it covers its eyes to start counting, I want you to vanish and never come back to find it again. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. We have people tuning in from every continent, and your support means everything to us as we continue to dive into these dark mysteries. Whether you are in a quiet room or on your daily commute, we are glad you are here. Now, let us get into our story. The air inside the Jining County Detention Center in Yunnan Province was always cold, carrying a permanent scent of damp concrete and cheap floor wax. It was a heavy, stagnant smell that seemed to settle in the back of your throat. If you were standing in the hallway of the detention block on that February afternoon, you would have heard the rhythmic, metallic clanging of heavy steel doors being opened and closed as the guards made their afternoon rounds. But beneath the sounds of the prison routine, there was a different noise echoing from cell number 9. It was a series of muffled, wet thuds, like a heavy bag of grain being dropped onto a hard floor. There was no shouting, no screaming, just the sound of heavy breathing and the scuffing of shoes against the rough ground. If you listened very closely, you could hear the faint, high-pitched giggle of someone who was enjoying a very dark and twisted kind of game. Li Qiaoming was 24 years old and had spent his entire life in the lush, mountainous forests of southwest China. He was a simple man, a logger who worked from dawn until dusk cutting timber to support his elderly parents and save money for his upcoming wedding. He was physically strong, with thick, calloused hands and a wide smile that made people trust him instantly. He was the kind of person who found beauty in the quiet of the woods and the smell of pine. He had never been in trouble with the law before, but in early 2009, he was caught cutting trees in a protected area without the proper government permits. It was a minor mistake, born out of a desperate need to provide for his family, and he was sentenced to a short stay in a local detention center while his case was processed. To Lee, this was just a temporary setback, a small price to pay for a future with the woman he loved more than anything. The mundane stretch of Lee's life in the detention center began with a strict and predictable schedule that never changed. He would wake up at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning to the sound of a sharp whistle. He would then fold his thin, scratchy wool blanket into a perfect square, a task that required 10 minutes of careful smoothing. He took pride in this small act of order, as it was one of the few things he could still control in his new environment. After his blanket was folded, he would stand in a line with the other inmates for the morning roll call. He would stare at the gray paint peeling off the opposite wall, counting the cracks to keep his mind occupied. He knew every blemish on that wall, every water stain that looked like a distant mountain range. He would then receive his breakfast, which was always a small bowl of watery rice porridge served in a chipped plastic bowl that felt light in his hands. The rest of his morning was spent performing labor, usually cleaning the communal areas or scrubbing the floors of the long hallways. He would move the heavy mop in long, deliberate strokes, watching the dirty water swirl into the drain. He found a strange kind of peace in the repetition of the work. It reminded him of the steady rhythm of his axe back in the forest. He would think about the trees, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, and the air. Lunch was served at exactly 12:30, and it was usually a repeat of the morning's porridge with a small piece of salted vegetable. Lee would eat slowly, savoring every grain of rice, trying to make the meal last as long as possible. He would then be allowed 30 minutes of recreation time in a small, walled-in courtyard where the only view was a square of blue sky. He would spend this time walking in circles, counting his steps until he reached 1,000. In the afternoons, the inmates were returned to their cells, where they were expected to sit in silence and reflect on their crimes. Lee would sit on the edge of his hard wooden bunk, his back straight, and stare at the heavy iron bars of the cell door. He would imagine the day he would finally walk through those doors and see his fiancée waiting for him at the station. He had calculated the exact number of hours remaining in his sentence, a number he recited. He would spend the late afternoon hours listening to the sounds of the prison. He could hear the guards talking in low voices in the distance, the clinking of keys, and the occasional cough of another inmate down the hall. Everything was so routine, so incredibly normal, that it was easy for him to forget that he was in a place of danger. He felt like a guest in a very dull hotel, waiting for the day his checkout time would finally arrive so he could go home. As the sun began to set, the shadows in the cell would grow long and distorted. Lee would lie down on his bunk and watch the light fade from the window. He would think about the dinner his mother was cooking back in the village, the smell of wood smoke and spices. He would close his eyes and try to transport himself back to the forest, to the sound of the wind in the trees and the feeling of the soft earth beneath his boots. He felt safe in his memories. The first subtle shift occurred during the final week of his detention. A group of older inmates, men who had been in the system for years and knew how to manipulate the guards, began to pay a lot of attention to Lee. They didn't threaten him at first, they just watched him. They would sit in the corner of the cell and whisper among themselves, their eyes fixed on the young logger. There was a change in the air, a shift from boredom to a predatory kind of energy. One of the guards, a man who had always been indifferent to the inmates, began to spend more time near cell number 9. He would stand by the door, his hand resting on his baton, and look at Lee with a strange, knowing expression. He didn't say anything, but he didn't intervene when the older inmates started to crowd around Lee during the afternoon quiet hours. The routine was being replaced by something unscripted, something that felt like a hidden trap. On the afternoon of February 8th, the guard walked over to the cell and signaled for the other inmates to gather in the center of the room. He didn't look at the security camera, which had been mysteriously turned away from the cell just minutes earlier. He said something in a low voice about group activities and building character. Then, one of the older inmates produced a dark piece of cloth, a blindfold, and walked toward Lee with a wide, toothy grin. You are standing in the center of a small, cramped cell. The air is cold, and you can hear the heavy breathing of the men surrounding you. A rough, dirty cloth is tied tightly around your eyes, plunging you into absolute darkness. You can feel the heat from the bodies of the other inmates as they move closer to you. Your heart is pounding against your ribs like a trapped bird. You want to ask what is going on, but your throat is so dry that you can't speak. Suddenly, you are pushed from behind. You stumble, your hands reaching out into the void, but there is nothing to grab onto. You hear a voice whisper the words Duo Mau Mau, the name of a game you haven't played since you were a child. But this isn't a game. A heavy fist slams into your ribs, and then another hit catches you in the side of the head. You fall to the floor, the cold concrete pressing against your cheek. Do you try to fight back in the dark? Lee Chiaoming didn't have a chance to fight back. He was beaten into a coma while the guards stood outside the door, watching the hallway for any sign of supervisors. When Lee was finally taken to the hospital, the authorities issued a press release that stunned the nation. They claimed that Lee had died because he was playing hide-and-seek with the other inmates and had accidentally run into a wall. It was a story so ridiculous that no one could believe it. The bizarre reveal came when the Chinese internet exploded in fury. The phrase Duo Mau Mau, or hide-and-seek, became a viral sensation, used by millions of people as a satirical shorthand for police brutality and official cover-ups. The public pressure was so intense that the government was forced to launch a second, independent investigation. They discovered that the prison bullies had been allowed to run the cell in exchange for keeping the others in line. The investigation revealed that Lee had been systematically beaten as part of an initiation ritual that the guards had not only ignored but encouraged. The hide-and-seek story was a pathetic attempt to protect the staff of the detention center. The guards involved were eventually fired and sentenced to prison, and the inmates who participated in the beating were given additional years on their sentences. Li Qiuming's death became a landmark case in China. It led to a massive overhaul of how detention centers were managed and brought a new level of scrutiny to the treatment of inmates in the legal system. For the family of Li Qiuming, the justice came too late to bring him back, but his name became a symbol of a movement for transparency and truth. A simple logger from the forest had inadvertently changed the laws of a giant nation, proving that even the most absurd lies can be defeated by the light of the truth. The story of Li Qiuming is a tragedy of a life cut short by the very people who were supposed to be the guardians of the law. It is a reminder that in the darkness of a prison cell, the truth can be as fragile as a child's game. But while the people of China were debating the meaning of justice in the wake of the hide-and-seek scandal thousands of miles away in Lebanon, another man was about to find out that even the most carefully guarded life is not safe. Kamal Medhat believed in the power of diplomacy and the safety of a high-security convoy. He spent his days brokering peace in the middle of a conflict that had lasted for generations. But like Li, he was about to encounter a trap that was hidden in plain sight, a danger that would come not from a prison cell, but from a road that he traveled every single day. The silence of the forest was about to be replaced by the thunder of a bomb in a refugee camp. Kamal Medhat was a man whose entire life was dedicated to brokering peace between warring factions in Lebanon's refugee camps. He was a master of diplomacy, a high-ranking official who moved through a world of shadows with the grace of a professional negotiator. He traveled in a heavily armored convoy, surrounded by a team of elite bodyguards who were trained to spot a threat from a mile away. He believed that his mission of peace was his greatest shield. But instead of achieving the reconciliation he had worked so hard for, Kamal would be killed by a bomb so precisely placed that it only destroyed his vehicle in the middle of a high-security zone. The mystery is how an assassin could plant a massive explosive on a road controlled by the very people Kamal was trying to help, without anyone seeing a single thing. It was a surgical strike that proved that, in the world of high-stakes politics, even the best armor has a hole. A massive explosion is not just a sound. It is a physical wave that punches the air out of your lungs and vibrates the very marrow of your bones. On that March afternoon in 2009, the quiet outskirts of the Mie Mie refugee camp were shattered by a roar so loud it felt like the sky itself was tearing open. Within seconds, the air was filled with a thick, choking cloud of black smoke that tasted like burnt rubber and pulverized ancient limestone. If you were standing near the entrance of the camp, the silence that followed the blast would have been even more terrifying than the noise. It was a heavy, unnatural quiet, broken only by the sound of small pieces of metal rain hitting the pavement and the low, guttering hiss of a fire starting in a ruptured fuel tank. The smell of high explosives, sharp and sulfurous, hung in the air like a poisonous fog, clinging to the ruins of what used to be a motorcade. Kamal Medhat was 58 years old and held the title of Deputy Representative for the Palestine Liberation Organization in Lebanon. He was a man of high stature, known for his calm voice and his ability to make enemies sit down at the same table. He was a husband and a father, a man who loved the complexity of his work, but also cherished the rare moments of peace he found with his family. He was an anchor of stability in a region that felt like it was always on edge. He spent his days moving between high-level meetings and the grimy reality of the refugee camps, acting as a bridge between the old guard and the new, more radical factions. He was a man of routine, but his routine was built on a foundation of extreme caution. He knew that his work made him a target for many different groups, and he accepted this as part of the job. He was a professional who understood that in his world, a single mistake could be the end of everything. The mundane stretch of March 23, 2009, began with a series of meticulous security checks that took nearly 2 hours to complete. Kamal's lead bodyguard, a man who had been with him for 10 years, personally inspected each of the 3 vehicles in the convoy. He checked the undercarriages with mirrors, verified the integrity of the bulletproof glass, and tested the encrypted radio systems to ensure they were working at peak performance. Once the vehicles were cleared, Kamal held a long meeting inside the Mie Mie camp. The meeting lasted for 3 hours, filled with the slow, deliberate exchange of coffee and political pleasantries. Kamal sat in a high-backed chair, listening to the grievances of the local leaders, his notebook open on his lap. He took notes in a neat, flowing script, capturing every detail of the negotiation. He was a man who found comfort in the process, in the slow build of trust. After the meeting concluded, there was another 20-minute delay as the security team coordinated with the local militias to ensure the road out of the camp was clear. Kamal spent this time shaking hands and thanking his hosts, his movements slow and practiced. He wasn't in a rush. He knew that haste was the enemy of safety. He watched as his bodyguards took their positions, their eyes scanning the rooftops and the alleyways for anything out of the ordinary. Finally, the convoy began to move. The 3 armored SUVs rolled slowly out of the camp gates, their tires crunching on the gravel. The lead vehicle moved 20 yards ahead of Kamal's Mercedes, and the third vehicle followed closely behind. The drivers maintained a specific distance, a gap designed to prevent a single attack from taking out more than one car. They moved at a steady speed, the engines humming in a synchronized rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. They traveled down a narrow, winding road that was the only paved exit from the camp area. The road was lined with small, unfinished concrete buildings and piles of construction debris. Kamal sat in the back seat of the middle car, his head resting against the thick leather upholstery. He was reviewing his notes, his mind already focused on the next meeting in Beirut. He felt the familiar, heavy weight of the armored door beside him, a reassuring wall of steel. The mundane stretch continued for another 5 minutes as they reached a section of the road that passed over a small bridge. The drivers were focused on the pavement, looking for any signs of disturbed earth or suspicious objects. They had driven this route hundreds of times, and they knew every pothole and every curve. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the asphalt. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly routine. The first subtle shift happened when the lead driver noticed that a small motorcycle, which had been parked on the side of the road for the last 3 days, was suddenly gone. It was a tiny detail, something most people wouldn't even register, but to a trained security professional, it was a red flag. He opened his mouth to report the change over the radio, but he never got the chance. The atmosphere around the convoy suddenly felt thin, as if the air was being sucked away. The road ahead was unnervingly empty. Usually, there were children playing near the bridge or street vendors selling fruit, but today, there was no one. The birds that usually nested in the trees near the water had stopped singing. It was a profound, heavy silence that signaled a shift in the environment. The lead driver gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles turning white, but the convoy was already committed to the narrow path of the bridge. You are sitting in the back seat of the armored Mercedes, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the only sound in the cabin. You can see the back of the lead vehicle just a few yards ahead, moving steadily through the golden afternoon light. You reach for your water bottle, and as your fingers touch the cool plastic, the world beneath you suddenly disappears. There is no flash of light, just a vertical jolt so violent that it feels like the earth has been kicked by a giant. You are being lifted into the air, the heavy armored car feeling as light as a toy. Your ears are ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowns out everything else. You see the dashboard of the car crumple like paper, and the thick bulletproof glass web with 1,000 cracks. For a split second, you are suspended in a state of weightless terror. Do you try to call out to your guards? Or do you realize that the very road you trusted has just turned into a weapon? The bomb had been hidden inside a manhole cover directly in the center of the road. It wasn't a crude device. It was a sophisticated directional explosive that had been triggered with pinpoint accuracy. The assassins had waited until Kamal's car was perfectly positioned over the charge. The blast was so powerful that it tore through the reinforced floor of the Mercedes, bypassing the side armor entirely. Kamal Medhat and 3 of his bodyguards were killed instantly. The bizarre reveal was the level of insider knowledge required to pull off such a strike. The bomb had to be planted in a high-security zone that was supposedly under constant surveillance by multiple rival factions. It wasn't just a random act of terror, it was a betrayal. Someone who knew Kamal's exact route and the precise timing of his departure had allowed the assassins to place the device and wait for the perfect moment. The armor was useless against a threat from within. The assassination sent shockwaves through Lebanon and the Palestinian territories. Kamal Medhat was one of the few people who could speak to everyone, and his death left a void that was quickly filled by more radical voices. The investigation into the bombing yielded no arrests and no clear answers. Theories ranged from internal power struggles to external intelligence agencies, but the perpetrators of the sophisticated hit vanished into the complex web of Lebanese politics. Kamal Medhat's death was a reminder that in a land defined by conflict, even a man of peace can become a casualty of the shadows. He had spent his life trying to bring people together, only to be torn apart by a device designed for total separation. He left behind a legacy of unfinished business and a family who would always wonder which of his friends had been the one to sign his death warrant. He was a bridge builder who was destroyed on a bridge. The assassination of Kamal Medhat was a high-level political hit, carried out with military precision in the heart of the Middle East. It was a tragedy of betrayal and the failure of extreme security measures. But while the people of Lebanon were mourning the loss of a great diplomat, thousands of miles away in the bustling streets of London, another man was about to meet his end. He wasn't a politician, and he certainly didn't have a team of armored vehicles. Ian Tomlinson was just a newspaper vendor trying to find his way home through a city gripped by protest. He didn't have enemies in high places, and he didn't move in the shadows. But like Kamal, he would find that a routine walk on a familiar street could lead to a sudden and inexplicable encounter with death. From the hills of Sidon to the pavement of London, the distance between safety and disaster was about to be proven as thin as a single, unprovoked push. In April of 2009, a 47-year-old man named Ian Tomlinson was walking home through the heart of London. He had spent his day selling newspapers and had absolutely no interest in the massive G20 protests happening around him. He was not carrying a sign, he was not shouting slogans, and he was keeping his hands in his pockets to stay out of trouble. He was exactly where he should be, doing exactly what any worker would do at the end of a shift. But instead of reaching his front door to have dinner with his family, Ian would suddenly collapse and die on the cold pavement. The mystery is why a man who was actively avoiding conflict was singled out by a police officer, and why the official report claimed he died of natural causes while blaming protesters for blocking help. The mystery is what really happened in those final seconds before his heart stopped, and why it took a random video to expose the truth. The air in central London on that April evening was thick with the scent of damp pavement and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. It was a cold, biting wind that whistled through the narrow stone corridors of the financial district. If you were standing near the Royal Exchange, you would have heard a constant, low-frequency thrumming. It was the sound of police helicopters hovering low over the rooftops, their searchlights cutting through the growing twilight. Beneath the mechanical roar of the engines, there was a different sound echoing off the historic buildings. It was the rhythmic, heavy chanting of thousands of people, a wall of noise that moved like a living thing. But alongside that was the sharp, staccato rhythm of boots hitting the ground. Hundreds of police officers in heavy tactical gear were moving in formation, their plastic shields clattering against their legs as they cordoned off the city streets. Ian Tomlinson was 47 years old, and lived a life that was defined by the quiet rhythm of a working man's schedule. He was a newspaper vendor, a man who spent his hours standing on street corners, handing out the daily news to commuters who were always in too much of a hurry to talk. He was a husband and a stepfather, someone who found his greatest joy in the simple comfort of his home and a warm meal. He was an anchor of normalcy in a very busy city. He was not a man of politics. He didn't care about global summits or international trade agreements. To Ian, the G20 summit was just an obstacle that made his commute more difficult. He was a large man who walked with a slight limp, moving with a slow and steady gait that suggested he had spent too many years on his feet. He was the kind of person you would walk past without a second thought, a quiet fixture of the London streets who just wanted to be home. The mundane stretch of April 1st, 2009, began at his usual spot at the bank of the city. He spent the entire day under a gray, overcast sky, holding out stacks of papers and nodding to the regulars. He followed a routine that was as predictable as the tides. He would count his change, stack the unsold papers at the end of the shift, and then begin the long walk back to his apartment. It was a journey he had made hundreds of times before. Because of the massive protests, the usual bus routes were cancelled and the subway stations were closed. Ian had to walk a much longer path, weaving through the back streets to avoid the heaviest crowds. He kept his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He moved with a quiet focus, his eyes fixed on the ground a few feet ahead of him. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was just looking for a way through. He walked past the towering glass buildings of the financial district, his heels clicking rhythmically on the stone. He stopped for a moment to light a cigarette, the small flame flickering in the wind. He watched the smoke drift away, disappearing into the cold air. He took a long drag, and then kept moving, his pace slow and deliberate. He passed a closed coffee shop, its windows boarded up with plywood, and a small park where the benches were empty. The walk home was an exercise in patience. Every few blocks, he would run into a new police line or a group of protesters blockading a street. He would simply turn around and find another way, his hands never leaving his pockets. He was a master of staying invisible in a crowd. He didn't look the officers in the eye, and he didn't engage with the people shouting into megaphones. He was just a man in a gray jacket, a ghost moving through a city on fire. As he reached the intersection near Threadneedle Street, the mundane stretch became a series of small, repetitive movements. He would walk 10 steps, stop to check the street signs, and then walk another 10 steps. He was tired. His legs ached, and he was thinking about the chair in his living room. He could almost taste the dinner his wife was preparing. He checked his watch. He was already 30 minutes late, but he knew he was almost through the worst of it. He entered a narrow passage that led toward the Royal Exchange. The walls were high and made of dark stone, trapping the sounds of the protest and making them feel closer than they actually were. He kept his head down, his chin tucked into his collar. He was a man of habit, and his habit was to keep moving until he reached his destination. He didn't realize that the passage he had chosen was about to become the site of a confrontation he never wanted. The first subtle shift occurred when the police began to move their line forward to clear the area. The atmosphere changed from a tense standoff to a sudden, aggressive push. The officers were no longer just standing guard. They were moving in a tight, coordinated wave. One officer, in particular, a man who had already been reprimanded multiple times for his aggressive behavior, stepped out of the formation. He wasn't looking at a protester. He was looking at Ian. Ian was walking away from the police, his back to them, still with his hands in his pockets. He wasn't blocking anyone, and he wasn't resisting. But the air around him suddenly felt charged with a different kind of energy. The sounds of the crowd seemed to fade into a muffled roar, replaced by the heavy, echoing sound of a single pair of boots accelerating behind him. The routine of his walk was about to be shattered by a choice made in a split second. You are walking down a quiet street, just a few blocks from the safety of your home. Your hands are in your pockets because it is cold, and your mind is on the dinner waiting for you. You hear the heavy thud of boots on the pavement behind you, getting closer. But you don't turn around because you haven't done anything wrong. Then, without any warning or any command to move, you feel a massive, violent force slam into the center of your shoulder blades. You are propelled forward, your hands still trapped in your pockets, so you can't even break your fall. Your knees hit the hard stone, followed by your chest and your face. The impact sends a jolt of white-hot pain through your body. You roll onto your side, looking up in total confusion at the wall of black uniforms standing over you. Your heart is hammering, and your breath is coming in short, ragged gasps. Do you try to stand up, or do you just lie there? Ian managed to get to his feet. He looked at the police, his face a mask of shock and pain, but he didn't say a word. He turned and kept walking, stumbling slightly as he tried to regain his balance. But just a few minutes later, he collapsed. Protesters and street medics rushed to help him, but it was too late. He died right there on the street. The initial police report claimed that he had died of a heart attack and that the protesters had thrown bottles at the medics. The bizarre reveal came when a tourist from New York came forward with a video he had captured on his handheld camera. The footage showed the truth that the police had tried to hide. It showed the officer, Simon Harwood, walking up behind Ian and violently shoving him to the ground for no reason at all. It showed that Ian was not a threat and that the police report was a complete fabrication. The video turned a natural death into a case of manslaughter. The legal battle that followed lasted for years. Simon Harwood was eventually fired from the police force, and in 2011, an inquest jury ruled that Ian Tomlinson had been killed unlawfully. Although Harwood was later acquitted of manslaughter in a criminal court, the case became a landmark for police accountability in the United Kingdom. It proved that in the age of technology, a single video can tear down a wall of lies built by the state. Ian Tomlinson's death was a tragedy of an innocent man caught in the machinery of a system that saw him as an obstacle rather than a human being. He was a man who lived a simple life and died a violent, unnecessary death. He left behind a family that had to fight for years just to get the truth acknowledged. He was the vendor who became the headline, a reminder that the most dangerous place to be is often right in the middle of a conflict you never joined. The death of Ian Tomlinson was a moment where the uniform of the state was used to hide a personal act of aggression. It was a case that forced a nation to look at the hidden violence that can occur when power is left unchecked. But while the people of London were demanding justice for a man killed by an unprovoked push across the English Channel in Paris, a much darker and more deliberate form of violence was being dissected in a high-profile trial. The gang of barbarians didn't act out of a sudden burst of adrenaline or a mistake in a police line. Their violence was slow, calculated, and fueled by a deep-seated hatred that turned a young man into a target simply because of who he was. As the verdict for Ilan Halimi was read in 2009, the world realized that some monsters don't wear uniforms, and some crimes are motivated by a darkness that a single video could never fully capture. In early 2006, a 23-year-old man named Ilan Halimi was working in a cell phone shop in Paris when a beautiful young woman walked in. He thought he was the luckiest guy in the world when she asked for his number and invited him out for a drink. His family expected a standard ransom demand that they could handle, believing this was a simple kidnapping for money. They thought they knew the rules of the world they lived in, but they were wrong. Instead of being treated as a prisoner for exchange, Ilan would be held for 3 weeks in a basement, subjected to unimaginable torture by a gang of 27 people. The mystery is why an entire neighborhood in a civilized city knew a man was being tortured in their building, but not one person called the police until it was too late. The mystery is how a community of people could listen to the music and the screams for 24 days and choose to say nothing. The air in the basement of the housing project in Bagnou was thick and stagnant. It carried the heavy, cloying scent of damp concrete mixed with the smell of cheap industrial floor cleaner and stale tobacco smoke. If you were standing in the hallway outside that heavy steel door in February of 2006, you would have felt a low, constant vibration through the soles of your shoes. It was the sound of aggressive rap music being played at a deafening volume. The lyrics were aggressive, the bass was booming, and it never seemed to stop. It was a wall of noise designed to swallow every other sound. But if you listened during the brief gaps between the tracks, you might have heard something else. It was a high-pitched, desperate scratching sound, like a trapped animal trying to claw its way through a wall. It was the sound of a human life being slowly erased, while the rest of the world went about its daily business. Ilan Halimi was 23 years old and had a smile that could light up any room. He was a hard worker, a son who looked after his mother, and a young man who was just starting to find his place in the world. He worked in a small phone shop in the Boulevard Voltaire, a busy district in Paris. He was an anchor of normalcy, a guy who liked fashion, hanging out with his friends, and the excitement of a new romance. He believed in the goodness of people. He was the kind of person who would go out of his way to help a customer with a complicated phone plan. He was polite, he was punctual, and he was deeply loved by his family. To the gang of barbarians, however, Ilan wasn't a person at all. He was a symbol. Because he was Jewish, they believed he was automatically wealthy. They didn't see the hard-working kid behind the counter. They saw a payday that would fund their criminal lifestyle and their greed. The mundane stretch of the kidnapping began with a routine that was as organized as a corporate office. The gang, led by a man named Yusuf Fofana, set up a rotation schedule for the guards. Every 8 hours, a a new set of young men would arrive at the basement to take their shift. They would bring their own snacks, their own music, and their own boredom. They sat in the dark, watching their prisoner as if they were watching a movie they had already seen. They followed a strict protocol for communication. Fofana would use different public payphones across Paris to call Ilan's family. He would speak in a cold, detached voice, demanding hundreds of thousands of euros. He would call at all hours of the night, over and over again. In total, the family would receive over 700 phone calls. Each call followed the same pattern: a demand, a threat, and then a recording of Ilan's voice to prove he was still alive. Back in the basement, the mundane stretch was defined by a terrifying level of apathy. The guards would eat their lunch just a few feet away from where Ilan was tied up. They would chat about soccer matches, complain about the weather, and trade jokes. They would use the same duct tape to silence Ilan that they used to fix their broken headphones. The act of holding a human being captive became just another part of their daily schedule, like going to a job. The neighborhood around the housing project was a busy, crowded place. People walked their dogs past the basement vents every evening. Mothers pushed strollers past the heavy doors on their way to the market. Teenagers hung out in the stairwells, smoking and talking. They all heard the loud music. Many of them saw the young men entering and leaving the basement at odd hours. But in this community, the routine was to mind your own business and stay silent. Day after day, the guards followed their instructions. They would check the restraints, adjust the volume of the music, and report back to Fofana. They moved through the city with total confidence, buying groceries and visiting their families as if they weren't participating in a slow-motion execution. The mundane stretch lasted for 3 weeks. 21 days of coffee breaks and torture, of soccer scores and suffering, all happening in the heart of Paris. The guards even had a system for cleaning the area. They would use basic household bleach to scrub the floors, the sharp chemical scent mixing with the decay. They did this every Tuesday and Friday, as if they were maintainers of a public space. They were so comfortable in their routine that they didn't even bother to hide their faces from the other residents in the building. They knew that the wall of silence in the project was stronger than any police investigation. The first subtle shift occurred when Fofana realized that Ilan's family didn't actually have the millions of euros he had imagined. The ransom demands started to become erratic. He wasn't just asking for money anymore, he was spewing hatred. The atmosphere in the basement changed from a business transaction to a theater of cruelty. The guards, who had previously been bored, began to take a more active and sadistic interest in their prisoners' physical condition. Fofana began to lose his grip on the professional nature of the kidnapping. He started to make mistakes, using his own cell phone for some of the calls and showing his face to more people in the neighborhood. He became obsessed with the idea that the police were closing in, even though the investigation was struggling to find any leads. The routine of the guards became more frantic, and the music in the basement was turned up even louder than before. You are lying on a cold, damp mattress in the dark. Your eyes are covered with layers of duct tape, and your hands are bound so tightly that you can't feel your fingers anymore. You can hear the thumping bass of the music through the floor, a constant, punishing vibration that makes your head ache. You haven't seen the sun in 20 days. You can smell the scent of cheap fast food being eaten nearby, and you hear the casual laughter of the men guarding you. You try to remember the face of your mother, or the feeling of the sun on your skin in the Boulevard Voltaire, but the pain is a loud, screaming noise that drowns out your memories. You hear a door creak open and the sound of heavy boots approaching. You don't know if they are bringing water or another hour of agony. Do you try to speak to them, to remind them that you are a human being, or do you just pray that the music will finally stop and let you sleep? On February 13th, 2006, the gang decided the job was over. They didn't release him. They drove him to a remote area near a railway track in the suburbs. They poured flammable liquid on him and set him on fire, leaving him for dead in the freezing cold. Ilan Halimi, with the last of his strength, managed to crawl toward a nearby road. He was found by a passerby, but he died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. He was 23 years old. The bizarre reveal came during the massive trial in 2009. The public was shocked to learn that 27 people were involved in the crime in some way. It wasn't just a few monsters. It was a small army of teenagers and young adults, including the woman who had acted as the bait. Most of them weren't hardened criminals. They were ordinary people who had been drawn into a vortex of hatred and greed, and who had chosen to watch a man die. The trial of the gang of barbarians forced France to confront a terrifying reality about the rise of anti-Semitism and the breakdown of social order in the urban suburbs. Youssouf Fofana was sentenced to life in prison, the maximum sentence possible. The other members received various prison terms, but the damage was already done. The neighborhood of Bagnou became a symbol of a community that had lost its moral compass and its courage to speak the truth. Ilan Halimi's death led to new laws and a national conversation about hate crimes in Europe. His mother, Ruth Halimi, fought tirelessly to make sure her son's story was told accurately and that the racial motivations were acknowledged. She eventually had his body moved to Israel, saying she didn't want his remains to stay in a country where he had been so brutally betrayed by his own neighbors. He remains a symbol of an innocent life lost to collective madness. The story of Ilan Halimi is a tragedy of a young man who was targeted for his identity and forgotten by the people who lived just a few feet away. It is a reminder that the loudest music cannot drown out the truth forever. But while the French courts were sentencing a gang of local thugs in 2009, another group of criminals was operating on a much larger and more professional scale, moving through Europe with a level of sophistication Ilan's killers couldn't imagine. The gang of barbarians was a local nightmare, but the Pink Panthers were an international phenomenon. While Fofana's group used duct tape and basements, this next group used DNA scrambling technology and high-speed getaway cars. They didn't target people for hate. They targeted the most valuable stones on Earth for profit. From the suburbs of Paris, we moved to the high-end jewelry stores of Dubai, where a different kind of criminal syndicate was about to be unmasked. The Pink Panthers were known as the most sophisticated jewel thieves in the world, famous for pulling off a multi-million-dollar heist in Dubai in less than 60 seconds. They were ghosts, leaving no DNA and no clues for years, moving across borders like shadows. But instead of remaining invisible, two of their top members would be brought down by a single, tiny mistake left on a discarded water bottle in a country they had not even robbed. It was a lapse in judgment. The mystery is how a gang that could bypass the most advanced security systems in the world was eventually undone by the simplest of human needs. They were military veterans who planned every second of their crimes with mathematical precision. Yet, they forgot that the smallest trace of their own biology could travel further than any stolen diamond. It was a paradox of genius and carelessness that would finally lead a global task force to their hidden doorstep in 2009. The air inside the Wafi Mall in Dubai was cool and perfumed, a sharp contrast to the scorching desert heat outside. It was the scent of luxury, a mix of expensive leather and high-end floral fragrances. But in an instant, that calm was shattered by the high-pitched shriek of tires on polished marble. Two white Audi S8 sedans roared through the glass doors, the sound of the engines echoing like thunder inside the massive, pyramid-shaped atrium of the shopping center. If you were standing there, you would have smelled the acrid, burning scent of rubber and the sharp tang of shattered safety glass. Thousands of tiny crystals lay on the floor, sparkling under the bright LED lights, like the very diamonds they were about to steal. There was no shouting, only the rhythmic, heavy thud of sledgehammers hitting reinforced display cases. It was a mechanical, focused sound that signaled the arrival of a group that moved with the speed of a storm. The members of the Pink Panthers were not typical street thugs. They were mostly veterans from the Balkans, specifically Serbia and Montenegro. They were men who had lived through the chaos of the Yugoslav wars and had learned the value of discipline, camouflage, and tactical planning. To their neighbors back home, they were often seen as successful businessmen or quiet family men who traveled frequently for work. They were anchors of normalcy in their small towns. One of these men was a 34-year-old named Dusko Poznan. He was a man of high intelligence who spoke multiple languages and could blend into a crowd in London, Tokyo, or Geneva without effort. He didn't have a criminal record that stood out, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a professional athlete. He lived a double life, moving between the high-stakes world of international diamond heists and the simple, domestic reality of his home life. The mundane stretch of the Dubai heist began months before the first hammer hit the glass. It started with a series of quiet, repetitive tasks that would seem incredibly boring to an outside observer. Dusko and his team spent weeks in Dubai acting like ordinary tourists. They would walk through the mall every single morning at 11 o'clock, counting the number of security guards and timing their patrols with a stopwatch hidden inside a shopping bag. It was slow work. They spent hours sitting in a rented apartment, staring at blueprints of the mall's layout. They mapped out every exit, every traffic light, and every security camera. They practiced their movements in a warehouse, using tape on the floor to represent the jewelry store. They did this over and over again, until every person knew exactly which shelf to smash and which bag to fill. It was a mundane exercise in repetition, designed to remove any element of surprise or luck. They also spent a significant amount of time acquiring the right tools. This involved visiting different hardware stores across the city, buying one item at a time so they wouldn't attract attention. They bought heavy-duty gloves, specifically chosen because they wouldn't leave fibers. They purchased black tactical clothing that was designed to be easily discarded. Each purchase was a small, routine transaction, handled with polite smiles and cash payments that left no paper trail. In the days leading up to the heist, they focused on the vehicles. They didn't steal them, they rented them using high-quality forged identities. They spent hours cleaning the cars, ensuring that not a single hair or skin cell from the previous renters was left behind. They treated the Audis like surgical instruments. They even practiced driving the getaway route multiple times at different hours, noting the exact timing of the lights and the flow of the afternoon traffic. They were masters of the mundane detail. They knew exactly how many seconds it took for the mall's security doors to close. They knew the frequency of the guards' radios. They even knew which side of the street would be in the shade during their escape, allowing them to blend into the shadows more effectively. This was not a crime of passion. It was a job. They approached it with the same boring, methodical focus that a carpenter brings to a long-term project. After the heist was completed and $15 million in jewelry was taken, the team followed their final routine, vanishing. They split up, taking different flights to different continents. They used their fake passports and their quiet, polite manners to move through international airports like ghosts. For years, they lived off the proceeds of their crimes, maintaining their images as normal citizens while the world's police forces struggled to find even a single name. The first subtle shift occurred in a place thousands of miles away from Dubai, in the small nation of Liechtenstein. A local detective was reviewing the files of an old, unsolved jewelry store robbery from several years prior. It was a cold case that no one expected to solve. He noticed a small piece of evidence that had been overlooked, a discarded plastic water bottle found in a trash can near the crime scene. It was a tiny, insignificant object in a sea of data. He decided to send the bottle for advanced DNA testing, a technology that hadn't been as precise when the crime first occurred. To his surprise, the lab found a clear profile. When they ran it through the international databases, they didn't find a criminal record, but they did find a match for a man who had been questioned briefly in another country for a minor traffic violation. That man was Dusko Poznan. The invisible wall of the Pink Panthers had a tiny crack. You are standing in the center of the Wafi Mall, and everything is moving in slow motion. You see the white Audi come to a stop just inches from your feet, and the sound of the engine is a low, vibrating growl in your chest. 4 men in black masks jump out, and they move with a level of coordination that is terrifying. They aren't running, they are gliding. Each man goes to a specific display case, and the sound of the glass breaking is like a series of small explosions. You are frozen in place, watching them scoop up millions of dollars in diamonds as if they were picking up groceries. You realize that they aren't even looking at you, you are just part of the furniture to them. One man checks his watch, and in exactly 58 seconds, they are back in the cars. The doors slam, and they are gone before you can even draw a full breath. Do you try to follow them? Or do you realize that you have just witnessed a perfect machine in motion? The bizarre reveal came in 2009 during the high-profile trial that followed Dusko's arrest. As prosecutors laid out the evidence, the world realized that the Pink Panthers weren't just a gang. They were a global network of hundreds of individuals. They had their own specialized logistics teams, their own forgers, and even their own diamond cutters who could reshape stolen stones to make them untraceable. They were organized like a multinational corporation. The trial also revealed how the Liechtenstein water bottle had led to a breakthrough. It wasn't just about Dusko. The DNA trail allowed investigators to map out the entire structure of the Balkan Syndicate. They realized that these men had been operating for over a decade, pulling off heists from Tokyo to Geneva. The phantoms were finally given names and faces. The trial proved that no matter how sophisticated the planning, the human element is always the weakest link. Dusko Poznan and his associates were sentenced to years in prison, marking one of the most significant blows to organized crime in European history. The Wafi Mall heist remains one of the most famous robberies of all time, a masterpiece of criminal engineering that was eventually defeated by a single discarded bottle of water. It was a victory for modern forensic science over military-grade planning, showing that even the most invisible shadows leave a trace. The Pink Panthers may have been dismantled, but their legacy changed how high-end security works forever. They forced the world to realize that the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who scream and shout, but the ones who plan in silence. They were men who understood that, in the modern world, information is more valuable than gold. But as the trial concluded in 2009, the focus of the criminal world was already shifting to a new kind of threat. The Pink Panthers used physical speed and military precision to take what they wanted, but in the luxury villas of Thailand, a different kind of violence was taking hold. It wasn't about diamonds or heists. It was about the dark side of the expat dream. While the Serbian thieves were being sentenced in a courtroom, a British businessman named Stephen Haywood was about to find out that in Phuket, the most dangerous people aren't the ones who crash through doors. In the early summer of 2009, a 59-year-old British businessman named Stephen Haywood was living what many would call the ultimate expat dream. He owned a stunning, multi-million-dollar luxury villa on the island of Phuket in Thailand, complete with panoramic views of the turquoise Andaman Sea. He was a successful, self-made man who had spent decades building his wealth so he could finally enjoy a peaceful retirement in a tropical paradise. But instead of waking up to the sound of the ocean and a morning swim, Stephen would be found brutally murdered inside his high-security home. He had been tied up, tortured, and stabbed multiple times in an attack that seemed far too personal to be a simple robbery. The mystery is why a man who was known for his generosity and had no obvious enemies was targeted for a professional hit by the very people he had trusted to help him manage his vast business empire. The sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs of Rawai Beach is usually a hypnotic, rhythmic lullaby that can put anyone to sleep. It is a deep, pulsing boom followed by the soft, rushing hiss of white foam retreating over the rocks. But inside the master bedroom of the villa, on that night in June of 2009, the only sound was the low, steady hum of the expensive air conditioning unit, struggling to keep the humid tropical night air at bay. If you were standing in the living room, you would have smelled the faint, sweet scent of expensive jasmine incense mixed with the salty tang of the sea breeze. But as you moved closer to the kitchen, the aroma changed. It became heavy and metallic, the unmistakable scent of fresh blood pooling on a cold tile floor. It was a sharp, iron-like smell that cut through the perfume of the tropical flowers outside, signaling that something terrible had happened. Stephen Haywood was 59 years old and carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man who had won at the game of life. He was a British national who had moved to Thailand years earlier, drawn by the culture and the opportunities for investment. He was a tall man with a friendly face and a loud, infectious laugh that made him a popular figure in the local expat community. He was the kind of guy who would always pick up the tab at the bar. He was an anchor of normalcy in a place where many people came to lose themselves. Stephen wasn't looking to hide, he was looking to build. He had invested heavily in local real estate and various business ventures, always making sure to employ local people and contribute to the community. He believed in the Thai way of doing things, which often relied on personal trust and handshakes rather than thick stacks of legal contracts and expensive lawyers. The mundane stretch of Stephen's life in Phuket followed a pattern that was as consistent as the tides. Every morning at 7 o'clock, he would wake up without an alarm, and walk out onto his balcony to check the weather. He would spend 10 minutes just breathing in the sea air, watching the fishing boats head out for the day. He found a deep sense of peace in this simple, daily ritual, a moment of silence before the business of the world began to call. After his balcony time, he would head down to the kitchen to make a pot of strong English tea. He had a specific way of doing it, warming the pot first and letting the leaves steep for exactly 4 minutes. He would sit at his heavy teak dining table, sipping his tea and reading the international news on his laptop. He would spend at least an hour responding to emails from his partners in London and Hong Kong, his fingers clicking steadily on the keyboard. Around 9 o'clock, he would go for a swim in his infinity pool. He would do exactly 20 laps, back and forth, his breath falling into a rhythmic pattern with the splashing of the water. He found that his best business ideas came to him while he was in the water. After his swim, he would dry off and prepare for his meetings. He always wore a crisp, light linen shirt and tailored shorts, the unofficial uniform of a successful businessman in the tropics. His afternoons were usually spent visiting his various project sites. He would drive his SUV through the winding, jungle-lined roads of Phuket, stopping to chat with the foremen and the laborers. He knew most of them by name and would often bring cold drinks for the crew. He would spend hours looking over architectural plans and checking the quality of the masonry. He was a man who appreciated the fine details of construction and the value of hard work. Then came the late afternoon cocktail hour at a luxury resort nearby. Stephen would meet with other expats and local business associates to discuss the latest market trends. They would sit on a terrace overlooking the water, the clinking of ice in their glasses mixing with the sound of the evening birds. It was a social routine that felt more like a hobby than a job. He would laugh, tell stories, and offer advice to anyone who asked, a true mentor to many. Before returning home, he would always stop at the same local market to buy fresh fruit and fish for his dinner. He enjoyed the vibrant colors of the dragon fruit and the smell of the charcoal grills along the street. He would walk back to his villa just as the sun was setting, the sky turning a deep shade of purple and orange. He would lock his gate, set the alarm, and settle in for a quiet evening. He felt perfectly safe behind his walls and his routine. The first subtle shift occurred when one of his longtime business associates, a man he had mentored for years, suddenly stopped attending their weekly meetings. This associate had been asking strange, detailed questions about Stephen's offshore bank accounts and the exact wording of his will. He seemed anxious, his usual confident smile replaced by a nervous twitch in his eye. It was a small change, but it left a lingering sense of unease in Stephen's mind. A few days later, Stephen noticed that his spare set of house keys, which he kept in a hidden drawer in his office, had gone missing. He searched the entire villa, moving every book and checking every pocket, but they were nowhere to be found. He assumed he had simply misplaced them during a busy day. He didn't think to change the locks. He didn't realize that the routine he found so comforting had also made him incredibly predictable to those watching. You are lying in your bed, drifting off to the sound of the air conditioner and the distant waves. Suddenly, you hear a faint, metallic click from the direction of the kitchen. It is the sound of a key turning in a lock, a sound you know perfectly because you hear it every day. Your heart skips a beat. You know you are alone in the house. You sit up, your heart hammering against your ribs, and you see the bedroom door slowly begin to swing open in the dark. 3 shadows move into the room, their faces covered by dark fabric. You try to reach for your phone on the nightstand, but a heavy hand slams down on your arm. You are being dragged out of bed and onto the floor. You can smell the scent of cheap cigarettes and sweat coming from the men. You try to shout, to ask them what they want, but a strip of heavy tape is slapped across your mouth. Do you fight back with everything you have? Or do you wait? The attackers didn't want his watch or his car. They wanted information. They spent hours torturing Stephen, trying to get the access codes to his private accounts. It was a cold, professional interrogation carried out in the middle of a paradise. When they realized he wouldn't or couldn't give them what they wanted, they decided to end it. Stephen Haywood was killed in the early hours of the morning, his body left on the floor of the villa he had built with pride. The bizarre reveal came when the Thai police tracked down the lead attacker, who turned out to be a low-level henchman for a local gang. He confessed that they hadn't acted alone. They had been hired by Stephen's business associate, the man he had trusted and mentored. The associate had fallen into massive debt due to a series of failed gambles and saw Stephen's wealth as his only way out. He had planned the murder to clear his debts and take over the empire. The betrayal shocked the expat community in Phuket. It highlighted the dangerous underbelly of the expat dream, where the lines between friendship and business often become blurred by greed. The associate was eventually arrested and sentenced to life in prison, along with the hired killers, but the damage was done. The luxury villa sat empty for years, a grim reminder that even in the most beautiful places on earth, the greatest danger often comes from within. Stephen Haywood's story is a tragedy of trust and the ultimate price of a life lived too openly. He was a man who believed that if you were good to people, they would be good to you. He left behind a legacy of successful projects and a cautionary tale for anyone looking to build a life in a foreign land. His death proved that a handshake is only as good as the man behind it, and that some people will burn down a paradise just to collect the insurance money. The murder of Stephen Haywood was a calculated act of betrayal, a story where the predator was someone the victim called a friend. It was a dark end to a life of success, a tragedy of greed in a tropical setting. But while the police in Thailand were closing the case on Stephen's death, thousands of miles away in El Salvador, another man was walking into a different kind of trap. He wasn't a businessman, and he didn't have a multi-million-dollar villa. Christian Poveda was a journalist who spent his life documenting the lives of those the world had forgotten. He believed that the truth could protect him, and that by humanizing the most violent people on earth, he could help bring about peace. But like Stephen, he was about to find out that trust is a fragile thing, and that sometimes the very people you are trying to save are the ones who will pull the trigger, ending a mission of mercy with a single bullet. Christian Poveda was a filmmaker who spent years living among the most dangerous gang members in El Salvador, the Mara 18. He did not just film them from a distance. He ate with them, lived with them, and earned a level of trust that no outsider had ever achieved. He was seen as a friend, almost a father figure, to the young men and women who the rest of the world saw only as monsters. He believed his camera was his shield and his honesty was his armor. But instead of being protected by the gang he had humanized in his documentary La Vida Loca, Christian would be shot in the head and left on a deserted road leading to their territory. The mystery is why a man who had become a voice for the voiceless was suddenly seen as a traitor by the very people whose stories he was trying to tell the world. The mystery is how a bond built over hundreds of days could be shattered by a single lie whispered in the dark. The heat in San Salvador in September is a thick, invisible wall that hits you the moment you step out of an air-conditioned car. It is not just the temperature, which often hovers around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but the crushing humidity that makes the air feel like wet wool. On that Wednesday afternoon in 2009, the sky was a hazy, washed-out blue, and the scent of parched earth and rotting tropical fruit hung heavy over the narrow, dusty roads. If you were standing on the road to Tonacatepec, you would have heard the relentless, high-pitched scream of the cicadas in the dry brush. It is a sound that vibrates in your skull, drowning out the distant hum of the city. But beneath that natural noise, there was the low, steady chugging of a silver 4x4 vehicle navigating the deep potholes. The engine sounded strained, coughing out small clouds of gray exhaust that smelled of burnt oil and old lead. Inside the car, the air was stagnant and smelled of stale coffee and the leather of a camera bag. There was no radio playing, only the sound of tires crunching over loose gravel and the occasional metallic thud of the suspension bottoming out. The silence inside the cabin was heavy, a sharp contrast to the chaotic energy of the slums Christian had just left. It was the kind of quiet that feels like a warning, but for Christian, it was just another day at work. Christian Poveda was 54 years old and had spent his life chasing the truth in some of the world's most violent places. He was a French-Spanish photojournalist with a weathered face and eyes that had seen everything from the civil wars in Central America to the fall of the Berlin Wall. He was a man of immense courage and empathy, someone who believed that if you look long enough into the eyes of a killer, you might find the child they used to be. He was an anchor of normalcy for the gang members of the Mara 18. In a world defined by tattoos, territory, and sudden death, Christian was the guy who showed up with a camera, and actually listened. He didn't judge their crimes, he documented their lives. He was the one who went to their funerals, visited them in prison, and brought them photos of their children. He was a constant, reliable presence in a life where nothing else was guaranteed. The mundane stretch of Christian's work on his film, La Vida Loca, lasted for over 16 months. It involved a repetitive, often exhausting routine of entering the no-go zones controlled by the gang. Every morning at 8 o'clock, he would check his camera gear, ensuring the lenses were clean and the batteries were fully charged. He would pack his bag with extra memory cards and a small notebook, moving with the practiced efficiency of a veteran. He would drive his silver 4x4 into the heart of the Soyapango district, navigating the labyrinth of narrow alleys and colorful, crumbling houses. He didn't use a map. He knew the territory by the graffiti on the walls and the faces of the lookouts at the corners. He would stop the car, roll down the window, and exchange a few words with the young boys guarding the entrance. He always used their slang, speaking in a low, respectful tone that showed he knew the rules. The majority of his time was spent simply waiting. He would sit for hours on plastic chairs in cramped living rooms, drinking lukewarm soda and watching the gang members live their daily lives. He filmed them cooking communal meals of rice and beans, the steam from the pots filling the small rooms. He filmed them playing with their toddlers, the tattoos on their faces contrasting with the soft, innocent expressions of the children. It was a slow, patient process. He would record the same conversations over and over again. He listened to them talk about their lost friends, their fear of the police, and their sense of hopelessness. He spent days in tattoo parlors, the buzzing of the needle providing a constant soundtrack as new recruits had the number 18 inked onto their skin. He never rushed a shot. He believed that the mundane moments were where the true story lived, far away from the sensationalist headlines of the press. Every evening, he would drive back to his home, a modest apartment in a safer part of the city. He would spend hours at his computer, reviewing the footage and taking notes. He followed a strict backup routine, copying the files onto 2 separate hard drives and storing one in a locked safe. He treated the digital data with the same reverence a priest treats a holy relic. He was meticulous, driven by the belief that these images could somehow change the cycle of violence. He also spent a lot of time acting as a mediator. He would meet with government officials and non-governmental organizations, trying to find ways to create jobs for the gang members who wanted to leave the life. He would carry messages between different factions, always maintaining his neutrality. His routine was a delicate balancing act, a bridge between 2 worlds that wanted to destroy each other. He felt that as long as he was useful, he was safe from the shadows. He would often spend his weekends at the local prison, visiting the gang leaders he had befriended during the filming. He would bring them cigarettes and news from the outside world, sitting across from them in the humid visiting room for hours. He knew the guards by name and always had a polite word for everyone. He was a man who moved through the machinery of the Salvadoran underworld with a level of comfort that most people found absolutely terrifying. The first subtle shift occurred shortly after the documentary was finished and began to circulate in the underground markets. A rumor started to spread within the Mara 18 that Christian was not just a filmmaker, but a police informant. It was a toxic, baseless lie, but in the world of the gangs, a rumor is as good as a death warrant. The atmosphere in the neighborhoods changed. The friendly waves from the lookouts were replaced by cold, suspicious glares. Christian noticed that the phone calls from his gang contacts were becoming shorter and more guarded. They would ask him strange questions about who he had been talking to in the government and why certain members had been arrested recently. He felt a change in the weight of the air when he entered the slums. It was a subtle pressure, a feeling of being watched not with curiosity, but with a predatory intent. His shield of trust was beginning to develop small cracks. On the morning of September 2nd, 2009, he received a phone call from a mid-level gang member he had known for a long time. The man sounded urgent and insisted that Christian meet him on a quiet road outside the city to discuss something important regarding the film's distribution. Usually, Christian met his contacts in public squares or inside the neighborhoods, but the man insisted this had to be private. It was a break from the routine. You are driving down a narrow, sun-drenched road. surrounded by dense green brush and the sound of cicadas. The air conditioning in your car is barely keeping the heat away, and you can feel the sweat sticking your shirt to the seat. You have made this journey 100 times before, and you trust the man you are going to meet. He is someone you have helped, someone you have filmed in his most vulnerable moments. You believe in the bond you have built. But as you round a bend, you see a group of men standing in the middle of the road. They aren't waving. They are standing perfectly still, their faces masked by their hats and their posture tense. Your heart begins to hammer against your ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. You realize that the silence of the road isn't peaceful. It is a trap. Do you put the car in reverse and floor it? Or do you stop, hoping that your history with these people will be enough to save you? Christian Poveda stopped the car. He believed that he could talk his way out of any situation, that his honesty would be recognized. But the men didn't want to talk. They dragged him from the vehicle and shot him 4 times in the head at point-blank range. They didn't take his camera, and they didn't take his money. They left him lying in the dirt next to his silver 4x4, a silent witness to the ultimate betrayal of the truth he had tried so hard to tell. The bizarre reveal came during the subsequent investigation. The man who had lured Christian to the road was indeed a member of the gang, but he had been pressured by others who were convinced Christian was a snitch. The rumor had been fueled by a single scene in the film where a gang member was shown crying, which the leadership saw as a sign of weakness that only a police agent would expose. They killed the man who humanized them because they were afraid of being human. The assassination of Christian Poveda sent a chilling message to journalists around the world. It proved that in the most violent corners of the earth, there is no such thing as a neutral observer. His death led to a massive crackdown on the gangs and a period of mourning for the international press corps. La Vida Loca became a tragic masterpiece, a film that cost its creator his life. Christian was buried in a quiet ceremony, remembered as a man of peace. Christian Poveda's story is a tragedy of a man who looked into the abyss and thought he could make it blink. He was a storyteller who became the story, a victim of the very cycle of violence he had spent his life trying to document and stop. He left behind a legacy of uncompromising journalism and a reminder that the truth is often the most dangerous thing you can carry. He died for his belief that no one is beyond redemption, even those who pulled the trigger. The death of Christian Poveda brings us to the end of our journey through the dark and mysterious events of 2009. It was a year defined by extreme violence and incredible stories of survival and betrayal. From the quiet kitchens of Japan to the sun-soaked roads of El Salvador, we have seen the ways in which the strange and the dark can enter even the most ordinary lives. Each of these 13 stories serves as a reminder of how thin the line is. We have explored the minds of killers, the bravery of activists, and the tragedies of the innocent. We have seen how a single unlocked drawer, a discarded water bottle, or a whispered rumor can change the course of history forever. These stories stay with us, not just because of the horror they contain, but because they reveal something fundamental about the human condition and the mysteries that still exist in the world around us, waiting for someone to find them. Thank you for joining me for this series. If you found these stories as compelling and haunting as I did, please remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share these cases with others who appreciate the strange, the dark, and the mysterious. Your support allows us to keep digging into the archives and bringing these forgotten truths to light. I will see you all in the next video, where we will dive into a new set of mysteries. Stay safe.